Welcome, adventurers. Tonight, beneath the flickering torchlight of our grand hall, we gather to share legendary tales from distant realms, stories of magic, monsters, and mighty heroes, to guide you gently into the realm of dreams. Before we cross into the veil of slumber, take a moment to cast a support spell, smash the like button, and join our growing adventuring party by subscribing. Also, I'm curious what realm you're watching from. Whether you're tuning in from Waterdeep, the Sword Coast, or a cozy tavern in California, share your location in the comments below. Your presence strengthens our fellowship and helps our magical community grow ever stronger. Now, the dice have been rolled, and the time for storytelling has come. Get in a comfortable position, dim the lights, and let the journey begin. Chapter 1. The First Breath of Dragons. In the primordial dawn, when the world was young, and the very stones still remembered their birth from cosmic fire, dragons ruled not merely as creatures of power, but as architects of reality itself. They were the first children of creation, born from the union of elemental forces and divine will, their wings casting shadows across continents that had never known the footstep of lesser beings. In those ancient days, the line between dragon and god was as thin as morning mist, and their breath could reshape mountains as easily as a potter molds clay. The great worms of that elder age possessed wisdom that spanned millennia and power that could crack the foundations of the earth. Bahamut, the platinum dragon, and Tiamat, the five-headed queen, were not yet the distant deities they would become, but walked among their kin as equals in a parliament of scales and flame. The dragons built their first cities not upon the ground, but suspended in the air itself, crystalline spires that caught and refracted the light of multiple suns, for even the celestial spheres bent to draconic will in those forgotten times. Yet for all their magnificence, the dragons discovered that immortality carried with it a terrible burden. They watched as shorter-lived races bloomed and withered like flowers in a single season, their brief lives burning with an intensity that even dragonfire could not match. The humans, elves, and dwarves possessed something that the eternal dragons had lost in their endless years: the fierce urgency of mortality, the desperate beauty of lives that flickered bright and brief against the darkness of eternity. It was ancient Io, the ninefold dragon, first among all dragonkind, who spoke the words that would echo through the ages. In their brevity, they achieve what our eternity cannot. They transform. The great progenitor saw in the younger races a reflection of what dragons had once been, when the world itself was new, and every moment held the promise of change and growth. Where dragons had become static in their perfection, mortals remained dynamic in their imperfection. The decision to create the Dragonborn was not born of mere whim, or the idle experimentation of immortal minds. It arose from a profound longing, the desire to recapture something that dragons had sacrificed upon the altar of their own transcendence. They sought to create beings who would carry the essence of draconic might within mortal frames, creatures who could bridge the vast chasm between the eternal and the ephemeral. In the secret chambers beneath the floating city of Dracothir, the greatest of the ancient worms gathered for the rite of sacred synthesis. Each dragon present represented one of the fundamental aspects of draconic nature: chromatic and metallic, chaos and order, destruction and preservation. They brought forth the most precious of their hoarded treasures, not gold or gems, but drops of their own heart's blood, each one containing the concentrated essence of their individual power. The ritual itself was a thing of terrible beauty. Ancient words in the draconic tongue, so old that speaking them caused reality to shiver and bend, were intoned as the dragon lords opened their veins. Bahamut's platinum blood fell like liquid starlight, while Tiamat's fivefold essence swirled in patterns of chromatic fire. The blood of ancient golds brought wisdom, the essence of silvers carried compassion, and from the chromatic lords came passion, ambition, and the terrible strength of unfettered will. But blood alone was not sufficient for the great working. The dragons knew that their chosen mortals must be willing participants in this transformation, for no blessing forced upon an unwilling soul could ever truly take root. They chose carefully from among the human tribes of that age, warriors whose courage had impressed even dragonkind, scholars whose thirst for knowledge rivaled that of the great worms themselves, and leaders whose nobility of spirit shone bright enough to catch the attention of beings who had witnessed the birth of stars. The transformation was not a gentle thing. Each chosen mortal was brought before the assembled dragon lords and given a choice that would echo through all their generations yet unborn. They could remain as they were, blessed with long life and the friendship of dragons, or they could undergo the great remaking and become something entirely new, no longer fully human, yet not quite dragon, forever balanced between two worlds, and belonging completely to neither. Those who chose the path of transformation were taken to the heart chamber, where the pooled dragon blood waited in basins carved from single crystals that had been growing since the world's foundation. As each volunteer stepped forward, the nearest dragon would breathe upon them, not the destroying breath of battle, but the creative breath of making, the same power that had once helped shape the world itself. The change was instantaneous and agonizing. Flesh that had been merely human expanded and shifted, taking on the texture and resilience of dragon hide. Features that had been soft and rounded became angular and proud, shaped by the proud heritage of their draconic benefactors. Most dramatically of all, they gained the ability to breathe as dragons breathed, acid and fire, frost and lightning, poison and raw force given form through mortal throats. Yet the true miracle was not in the physical transformation, but in the awakening of something deeper. The first Dragonborn found themselves able to understand the Draconic tongue as if it were their native language, to read the ancient scripts that recorded the world's history, and to sense the presence of their Draconic ancestors across vast distances. They had become living bridges between the mortal and the divine, capable of understanding both the urgent needs of the short-lived races and the vast perspectives of their immortal patrons. The dragons named them Draconis sanguis, those of dragon blood, but the newly transformed chose a simpler title for themselves. They were Dragonborn, children of two worlds, carrying within their hearts both the fierce loyalty of humanity and the proud independence of dragonkind. They were the living proof that transformation was possible, that the gulf between mortal and immortal was not insurmountable, and that even the mightiest could find new purpose in sharing their gifts with those who had less. In those first golden days, the Dragonborn served as ambassadors and interpreters, helping to forge the first true alliances between dragonkind and the younger races. They built the first settlements where humans and dragons could meet on equal terms, great amphitheaters carved into mountainsides, where councils could be held under the open sky. Their children were born already bearing the marks of their heritage, scales gleaming like jewels in the sunlight, eyes that held depths of ancient wisdom despite their young years. The early Dragonborn established the traditions that would guide their people through the ages to come. They created the Code of Draconic Honor, which taught that their power came not as a right, but as a responsibility, to protect the innocent, to seek knowledge and wisdom, and to bridge the gaps between different peoples. They founded the first libraries where draconic lore could be preserved for future generations, and they established the martial traditions that would make Dragonborn warriors feared and respected across the known world. But perhaps most importantly, they learned to balance the draconic aspects of their nature with the human elements that remained. The pride and independence that came with their dragon heritage had to be tempered with the compassion and cooperation that marked the best of humanity. They discovered that their breath weapons were most powerful when used in defense of others, rather than in conquest, and that their natural leadership abilities flourished when exercised in service to just causes. As the generations passed, and the first Dragonborn aged into elder statesmen, they began to dream of greater things. The scattered human tribes and emerging civilizations needed guidance and protection that only beings of their unique heritage could provide. The dragons themselves, inspired by the success of their great experiment, began to speak of empire, not the domination of conquest, but the leadership of wisdom and strength combined. It was from these dreams that the great empire of Arcosia would eventually rise, a civilization that would represent the highest achievements possible when dragon ambition was wedded to mortal determination. The first Dragonborn became the founding fathers and mothers of a nation that would span continents and endure for thousands of years, their legacy written in characters of flame across the scroll of history. Yet even in those early days of wonder and achievement, the seeds of future tragedy were already being sown. For the gift of draconic blood carried with it not only the strengths of dragonkind, but also their weaknesses, the pride that could become arrogance, the independence that could become isolation, and the fierce loyalty that could transform into unforgiving vengeance when betrayed. The Dragonborn had been created to bridge two worlds, but in doing so, they had inherited the conflicts and contradictions of both. They were destined to know both the greatest triumphs and the most devastating failures, to build wonders that would stand for millennia, and to see them crumble into dust through the very passions that had made their creation possible. And so, as we look back across the vast expanse of history to those first moments when mortal flesh first took on the aspect of dragons, we see both the beginning of a great saga and the foreshadowing of its inevitable end. The Dragonborn were born from the noblest intentions of beings who sought to share their gifts with those they had come to respect and admire. They achieved heights of glory that few civilizations have ever matched, and they fell to depths of tragedy that serve as eternal warnings about the price of hubris. In their story, we see reflected the eternal struggle between the desire for transcendence and the acceptance of limitation, between the ambition to rise above one's origins and the wisdom to remember where one came from. The first breath of dragons gave life to a people who would know both the ecstasy of flight and the agony of falling, who would experience the warmth of divine favor and the cold of divine abandonment. Their legacy reminds us that even the greatest gifts come with their own burdens, and that the attempt to bridge different worlds may sometimes leave one belonging fully to none. Yet in their willingness to accept such a fate, the Dragonborn proved themselves worthy of the draconic blood that flowed in their veins, demonstrating that true nobility lies not in the absence of struggle, but in the courage to face that struggle with honor and grace. Chapter 2. Arcosia, the Golden Empire. Power reveals character, but absolute power reveals the soul's true nature, whether noble or corrupt. In the annals of history, few civilizations have embodied this truth more magnificently than Arcosia, the Golden Empire of the Dragonborn, whose crystal spires once caught the light of dawn and held it throughout the day, casting rainbows across valleys that knew no shadow of want or fear. From the scattered settlements of the first Dragonborn arose a vision of empire that would reshape the very concept of civilization. Where other peoples built their cities upon the bones of the earth, the Arcosians reached toward the heavens, constructing floating citadels that drifted serenely through cloud-touched skies. Their architecture defied the limitations that bound lesser races, for they possessed not only the engineering wisdom inherited from their draconic ancestors, but the breath weapons to forge materials that no ordinary fire could shape. The founding of Arcosia began not with conquest, but with convergence. As the scattered Dragonborn clans encountered one another across the vast wilderness of the young world, they recognized in each other's eyes the same draconic fire, the same noble bearing, the same sense of destiny that set them apart from purely mortal peoples. They came together not as strangers seeking alliance, but as long-separated family members finally reunited, their shared heritage providing bonds stronger than any treaty could forge. Pythraxis the Golden, whose scales caught sunlight like captured flames, was the first to speak the dream that would become reality. Standing before the assembled clan leaders on the plateau that would become known as the Throne of Winds, he spread his arms wide and spoke in the ancient draconic tongue. "We are the children of dragons, heirs to the wisdom of ages and the strength of storms. Why should we content ourselves with villages when we could build an empire that spans the sky itself?" The vision he painted was intoxicating in its scope and nobility, an empire built not on the subjugation of the weak, but on the elevation of the worthy. Cities that floated among the clouds, connected by bridges of crystallized lightning and pathways of solid wind. Libraries that contained not merely the wisdom of mortals, but the accumulated knowledge of dragons stretching back to the world's foundation. A civilization where justice flowed as pure as mountain streams, and learning blazed as bright as dragon fire. The early years of Arcosia's construction were a testament to what Dragonborn could achieve when their natural gifts were guided by noble purpose. They discovered techniques for working with materials that existed nowhere else in the world. Crystal that grew like living things under the influence of carefully controlled breath weapons, metals that could be shaped by concentrated force rather than crude hammering, and stones that could be convinced to defy gravity through the proper application of draconic will. The great city of Vor-Krugal, whose name meant heart of the sky in the ancient tongue, became the crown jewel of their civilization. Built upon a foundation of crystallized cloud stuff, and anchored to the world below by chains of pure force, it rose in concentric circles toward a central spire that reached so high that its apex was lost in the realm of perpetual twilight. Each level of the city served a different function, from the great forges at its base, where master crafters worked with dragon flame, to the observatories at its peak, where scholar sages studied the movements of stars and the patterns of fate. The citizens of Arcosia lived lives that would have seemed miraculous to any other people. Their children learned to read the ancient draconic scripts before they could walk properly, and by adolescence could debate philosophy with minds that had been shaped by contact with draconic wisdom. Their artisans created works of such beauty that even the dragons themselves would descend from their mountain lairs to trade ancient treasures for Arcosian masterpieces. But it was in their understanding of magic that the Arcosians truly excelled. They developed new schools of spellcasting that drew directly upon their draconic heritage, weaving together the raw elemental forces of their breath weapons with the sophisticated magical theories they had inherited from their human ancestors. Their war mages could call down lightning that would dance at their command, summon walls of flame that would burn only what they chose to destroy, and create ice constructs so perfect they seemed like living creatures carved from winter itself. The military might of Arcosia was built not upon crude force, but upon the marriage of individual excellence with coordinated strategy. Every Dragonborn warrior was trained not merely in the use of weapons and armor, but in the tactical application of their breath weapons and the principles of aerial combat. They fought as their dragon ancestors had fought, not as earthbound infantry trudging through mud, but as masters of three-dimensional warfare who could strike from any angle and withdraw to positions their enemies could never reach. The Platinum Guard, the elite protectors of the imperial throne, exemplified everything that Arcosia represented. Each member was chosen not merely for physical prowess, but for moral excellence and intellectual achievement. They served not for personal glory or material reward, but because they genuinely believed in the noble ideals that their empire represented. Their armor was forged from metals that existed only in the deepest dragon hordes, inscribed with runes that told the story of their people's journey, from mortal flesh to draconic glory. Yet Arcosia's true strength lay not in its military might or magical achievements, but in its system of governance. The Dragonborn Council, composed of representatives from each of the great clans, operated on principles that were revolutionary for their time. Decisions were made not through the arbitrary will of a single ruler, but through careful deliberation guided by ancient codes of honor and justice. The emperor himself was not a tyrant, but a servant of the people's will, chosen for his wisdom and virtue rather than his bloodline or political connections. The judicial system of Arcosia was based upon the draconic concept of proportional justice, the idea that punishment should not merely fit the crime, but should serve to restore balance to the community that had been disrupted. Criminals were not simply locked away or executed, but were given opportunities to make amends through service to those they had wronged. The death penalty was reserved only for those who had violated the most sacred trusts, and even then, it was carried out with ceremony and regret rather than celebration. The Arcosian approach to education reflected their belief that knowledge was the greatest treasure that could be accumulated. Their universities welcomed students from all over the known world, regardless of race or social status, requiring only that they demonstrate both intellectual ability and moral character. The libraries of Vor Kragel contained works in dozens of languages, from the practical manuals of human craftsmen, to the philosophical treatises of elven sages, to the engineering texts of dwarven master builders. Their scholars made discoveries that advanced not merely their own civilization, but the sum of mortal knowledge itself. They mapped the movements of celestial bodies with precision that would not be matched for thousands of years, developed mathematical principles that could predict everything from weather patterns to the behavior of magical energies, and created philosophical frameworks that helped explain the relationship between divine will and mortal choice. The arts flourished in Arcosia as they had in no civilization before or since. Their poets created epic verses that could move even dragon hearts to tears. Their painters developed techniques for capturing light that made their work seem to glow with inner fire, and their musicians composed symphonies that incorporated the harmonic frequencies of Dragonborn breath weapons to create sounds that no purely mortal throat could produce. Architecture in Arcosia transcended mere building to become a form of sculpture on a continental scale. Their cities were not simply places where people lived and worked, but were themselves works of art that transformed the very landscape around them. The floating gardens of Hatral bloomed with flowers that existed nowhere else in the world, their colors shifting with the time of day and the season of the year. The crystal cascades of Thermidor channeled mountain streams through carefully crafted channels that created music as the water flowed, each city singing its own unique song to the sky. Trade and diplomacy with other nations brought Arcosia into contact with civilizations that were simultaneously awed and intimidated by their achievements. The humans marveled at their floating cities and begged to learn their construction secrets. The elves, despite their own ancient wisdom, found themselves impressed by the philosophical sophistication of Arcosian thought. Even the dwarves, traditionally suspicious of magic and aerial construction, grudgingly admitted that the engineering principles behind the floating cities represented genuine innovation rather than mere showmanship. The wealth of Arcosia was measured not in gold or gems, though they possessed both in abundance, but in the richness of life that their civilization made possible. Their citizens lived longer and healthier lives than any other people. Their children grew up with opportunities for advancement limited only by their own talents and ambitions, and their elderly were revered for their wisdom rather than discarded as burdens. Yet, even at the height of their golden age, there were those among the Arcosians who recognized that their very success carried within it the seeds of potential downfall. The ancient dragon traditions spoke of the cyclical nature of all things, the truth that every rise contained within it the potential for fall. Every creation carried the possibility of destruction. The wisest of their philosophers warned that a civilization which grew too proud of its own achievements might begin to believe that it was exempt from the laws that governed all mortal endeavors. These warnings, however, were drowned out by the chorus of success and the intoxicating song of ever greater achievements. The younger generation of Dragonborn, born into prosperity and raised in floating palaces, began to lose touch with the humility that had characterized their ancestors. They started to see their Draconic heritage not as a gift that came with responsibilities, but as proof of their inherent superiority over all other peoples. The transformation was subtle at first, a tendency to assume that Arcosian solutions were always the best solutions, a reluctance to consider that other civilizations might have wisdom worth learning, a growing impatience with diplomatic negotiations that didn't immediately yield the results they desired. The noble goal of sharing their gifts with the world gradually became the assumption that the world needed to be reformed according to Arcosian principles, whether it wanted such reform or not. It was during this period of growing pride and certainty that the first rumors began to reach Arcosia of another great empire rising in distant lands. The tieflings of Baal Tarath, inheritors of infernal power just as the Dragonborn were heirs to draconic might, were building their own civilization based on very different principles. Where Arcosia emphasized honor and nobility, Tarathi embraced ambition and cunning. Where the Dragonborn sought to elevate through example, the Tieflings preferred to advance through contract and obligation. The initial reaction of most Arcosians to news of this rival empire was dismissive. How could any civilization built upon infernal principles hope to match the achievements of those who carried the blood of dragons? How could beings who had sold their souls for power compare to those who had been freely given the greatest gift in creation? Such attitudes would prove to be the first steps on a path that would lead to centuries of warfare, and ultimately, to the destruction of everything that Arcosia had built. But in those last golden years before the shadows began to gather, Arcosia stood as proof that mortals could indeed achieve greatness worthy of their draconic heritage. Their cities floated like jewels against the sky. Their people lived lives of dignity and purpose, and their civilization represented the highest ideals of justice, learning, and beauty, made manifest in stone and crystal and living flame. The legacy of Arcosia reminds us that the summit of achievement is also the most precarious place to stand, where the view is magnificent, but the fall is longest. In their glory, we see what mortals can accomplish when they reach beyond the limitations of their birth. In their eventual fate, we learn that even the most noble civilizations must remain vigilant against the pride that whispers that success is a destination rather than a journey, and that greatness achieved can never be lost. Chapter 3. The Tarathi Wars. Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Yet when two prideful civilizations meet, the resulting conflagration can consume not merely themselves, but the very world around them. No conflict in recorded history better exemplifies this terrible truth than the centuries-long war between Arcosia the Golden and Tarathi the Infernal, a struggle so devastating that entire continents still bear its scars, and whose echoes continue to reverberate through the souls of Dragonborn to this day. The first contact between these two great empires came not through diplomacy or trade, but through collision, the inevitable meeting of expanding civilizations whose fundamental natures could not coexist peacefully in the same world, where Arcosia's floating cities drifted serenely through cloud-touched skies. Tarathi's dark towers thrust upward from the earth, like black daggers seeking to pierce the heavens themselves, where Dragonborn drew their power from the noble heritage of metallic dragons and the primal forces of creation. Tieflings had bound themselves through infernal contracts to the ordered evil of the Nine Hells. The philosophical differences between these two peoples ran deeper than mere political disagreement. The Dragonborn believed that power should be wielded in service to justice and the elevation of the worthy, that strength came from within through noble purpose and draconic heritage. The Tieflings held that power was best acquired through cunning negotiation and binding contracts, that true strength lay in understanding and exploiting the weaknesses of others, and that the universe itself operated according to principles of obligation and debt that could be manipulated by those clever enough to read the fine print of reality itself. When Arcosian explorers first encountered Tarathi border settlements in the contested lands of what would later be called the Dragondown Coast, the meeting was cordial enough on the surface. Both peoples were too sophisticated to resort immediately to violence, too proud to show weakness before potential rivals, and too curious about these strange mirror images of themselves to simply withdraw without further investigation. The Dragonborn delegation, led by Prince Baracus the Platinum-Scaled, approached with the assumption that any reasonable beings would recognize the superiority of Arcosian civilization and seek to learn from their example. The Tarathi Reception Committee, headed by Duchess Glacia Mordeth of the Crimson Compact, welcomed their draconic visitors with elaborate ceremonies that seemed to honor their achievements while subtly emphasizing the wealth and sophistication of their own empire. Every courtesy was observed, every protocol followed to the letter, yet beneath the polished surface lay currents of mutual contempt that would prove impossible to bridge. Prince Baracus, raised in the noble traditions of his people, spoke openly of Arcosia's achievements and their desire to share the benefits of their advanced civilization with all worthy peoples. He described their floating cities, their mastery of draconic magic, their systems of justice and education, their philosophical commitment to the elevation of all thinking beings. In his mind, he was offering the greatest gift possible, the opportunity for the tieflings to abandon their infernal contracts and embrace the cleaner, nobler path of draconic enlightenment. Duchess Glacia, schooled in the subtle arts of infernal diplomacy, heard not generous offer, but insufferable condescension. O'er ears, the prince's words carried the implicit assumption that Tarathi's civilization was somehow lacking, that their own achievements were merely crude attempts to copy Arcosian excellence, that their chosen path was a mistake that could be corrected through proper instruction. Her response was a masterpiece of diplomatic poison, praising Arcosian accomplishments, while subtly questioning their sustainability, expressing admiration for their idealism, while wondering aloud whether such principles could survive contact with the harsh realities of an imperfect world. The negotiations that followed stretched across months, each side probing the other's weaknesses while jealously guarding their own secrets. The Dragonborn offered trade agreements that assumed Arcosian superiority in all meaningful fields of endeavor. The Tieflings proposed treaties filled with clauses and subclauses that would have bound the Dragonborn to obligations they barely understood. Neither side was willing to accept a relationship of equality, for both believed themselves inherently superior to all other peoples. The breaking point came during a formal dinner in the crystal halls of Vorkragel, when Prince Barakas, his patience finally exhausted by what he saw as Tarathi duplicity and obstinacy, rose to his feet and spoke words that would echo through the centuries. Your people have sold their souls for power, yet you dare to speak as equals to those who carry the blood of dragons freely given. Your contracts bind you to masters who view you as tools, while we serve ideals that elevate us toward divinity itself. There can be no true alliance between the children of light and the servants of darkness. Duchess Glacia's response was delivered with the cold precision of a blade between the ribs. How noble it must be to inherit power rather than earn it, to serve ideals rather than understand realities, to float above the world in crystal towers, while others dirty their hands with the actual work of governance. But tell me, Prince of the Clouds, what happens when your inherited gifts meet earned cunning, when your noble ideals collide with pragmatic ambition? We shall see whose foundations prove more solid when the ground begins to shake. War was not declared that night, for both civilizations were too sophisticated for such crude directness. Instead, there began a complex dance of proxy conflicts, trade disputes, and territorial encroachments that would gradually escalate into open hostility. Arcosian merchants found their goods mysteriously delayed at Tarathi ports, their contracts voided on technical grounds that seemed to appear overnight. Tarathi caravans traveling through Arcosian territories discovered that their safe passage agreements had somehow become void due to interpretive differences in ancient treaty language. The first actual combat occurred in the disputed territory known as the Thorn March, where both empires had established settlements that gradually expanded until their borders met. A group of Arcosian colonists, led by the young Dragonborn hero Thorkel Flamebreath, accused Tarathi settlers of stealing water from a spring that had traditionally supplied their community. The Tiefling response, orchestrated by the infernal advocate Mesrius Darkbargain, was to produce a series of contracts and land grants that supposedly proved their legal right to the entire watershed. What followed was not a battle in any traditional sense, but a legalistic nightmare that gradually spiraled into violence. Thorkel, raised in the straightforward traditions of Draconic honor, could not understand how words on parchment could override obvious justice and long-established custom. Mesrius, trained in the Byzantine complexities of infernal law, could not comprehend how anyone could ignore properly executed contracts in favor of vague appeals to tradition and fairness. Lull finally lost patience and burned the disputed contracts with his dragon's breath, declaring that no true law could countenance such obvious theft. Mesrius responded by invoking obscure clauses that supposedly made such destruction an act of war against the entire Tarathi Empire. The local confrontation escalated into a regional conflict as both sides called upon their respective empires for support, and the regional conflict became the opening movement of a symphony of destruction that would play for centuries. The early phases of the Tarathi Wars were characterized by mutual underestimation on both sides. The Dragonborn, secure in their floating cities and confident in their magical superiority, believed that a few decisive victories would convince the Tieflings to abandon their foolish resistance and accept Arcosian guidance. The Tieflings, protected by their infernal contracts and confident in their tactical cunning, assumed that their devil-enhanced armies would quickly overwhelm these naive idealists who had never learned to fight dirty. Both sides discovered that their opponents were far more formidable than expected. Arcosian war mages, wielding the concentrated fury of dragonfire and calling down lightning from clear skies, found themselves facing Tarathi devil knights whose infernal armor could turn aside even draconic breath weapons. Tarathi battle sorcerers, armed with spells that could bind the very souls of their enemies, discovered that Dragonborn naturally resisted such enchantments through the purity of their draconic heritage. The war escalated with each engagement, as both sides brought ever more devastating weapons to bear. The Dragonborn called upon their ancient dragon allies, and the skies above battlefields darkened with the wings of great worms, whose breath could melt stone, and whose presence alone was enough to break the morale of ordinary soldiers. The Tieflings responded by opening gates to the nine hells themselves, allowing greater devils to walk the mortal world and lead armies of the damned against the crystal citadels of their enemies. The Battle of Cinderfell marked the first time in the conflict that both sides truly understood what they were facing. An Arcosian expeditionary force, led by the gold dragonborn general Piraxis the Wise, and supported by 3 ancient gold dragons, had cornered a Tarathi army in the volcanic valley that gave the battle its name. Victory seemed assured, until the Tiefling commander, Duchess Levistus Nightfire, activated a contract that had been years in the negotiation, one that allowed her to temporarily transform the entire valley into an extension of Malbolge, the 6th layer of hell. The very air became thick with sulphurous smoke that burned Dragonborn lungs, despite their resistance to fire. The ground beneath their feet turned to molten glass that could support the hooved feet of devils, but trapped the clawed boots of Dragonborn warriors. Most devastating of all, the gold dragons found their sacred breath weapons turned against them, as the hellish environment absorbed their cleansing flames and redirected them as blasts of soul-searing hellfire. General Piraxis, watching his forces being systematically destroyed by the transformed battlefield itself, made a decision that would haunt Dragonborn military doctrine for generations to come. Rather than retreat and preserve his army for future battles, he chose to activate the Draconic Concordance, an ancient ritual that would strip years from his own life in exchange for the temporary awakening of his full Draconic heritage. His transformation into a being of pure elemental force allowed him to match the hellish environment with his own reality-altering presence. But the cost was terrible. The battle ended with both armies effectively destroyed, the valley itself rendered uninhabitable for decades to come, and both commanding officers dead, or forever changed by their sacrifices. Piraxis survived the battle but aged centuries in moments, his scales turning from gold to tarnished brass, his eyes clouding with the weight of premature ancient wisdom. Duchess Levistus paid an even steeper price. Her contract's fulfillment bound her soul irrevocably to Malbolge, leaving her body alive but empty, a hollow vessel that served infernal interests without retaining any trace of her original personality. The devastation at Cinderfell shocked both empires into a temporary ceasefire, but the respite only allowed them to develop even more terrible weapons for the next phase of the conflict. Arcosian artificers began crafting siege engines powered by captured dragon breath, weapons that could level entire cities with single shots. Tarathi contractrites developed rituals that could bind the souls of entire populations, turning conquered territories into literal extensions of the 9 hells. The war's middle period saw the conflict expand beyond the original territorial disputes to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of reality itself. Each side became convinced that the other represented an existential threat, not merely to their political interests, but to their very right to exist. Arcosian philosophers argued that allowing infernal influence to spread unchecked would inevitably corrupt all mortal civilization. Tarathi theorists countered that Draconic idealism was a luxury that weakened peoples against the harsh realities of a universe governed by power and pragmatic calculation. Entire generations grew up knowing nothing but war, their lives shaped by the endless conflict between these two visions of what mortal civilization should become. Dragonborn children learned to breathe fire before they learned to speak, trained from birth to serve in the endless struggle against infernal corruption. Tiefling youth were schooled in the arts of war and contract negotiation with equal fervor, raised to see every interaction as a potential battlefield where the unwary could lose, not merely their lives but their souls. The great cities of both empires became fortresses, designed as much to project power as to protect their inhabitants. Arcosia's floating citadels bristled with crystal towers that could focus dragon breath into beams of destruction capable of melting mountains. Baal Tarath's dark spires extended deep underground, their foundations anchored in the upper reaches of hell itself, their walls inscribed with contracts that bound the very stones to infernal service. Heroes and villains emerged from both sides, their deeds sung in epic poems that grew more elaborate with each telling. The Dragonborn celebrated champions like Bahamut's Chosen, a silver-scaled paladin whose holy sword could cut through any infernal contract, and Saradace the Stormcaller, whose mastery of lightning magic earned her the title of the Thunder of Justice. The Tieflings honored figures like Mammon's Advocate, whose legal arguments could convince devils to break their own contracts, and Belphegor the Strategist, whose battle plans were said to be written in the blood of his enemies upon parchment made from their flayed souls. Yet, for all the individual heroics and tactical brilliance displayed by both sides, the war's ultimate trajectory was toward mutual destruction. Each victory came at such terrible cost that it weakened the victor almost as much as the defeated. Each new weapon or tactic developed by one side prompted an even more devastating response from the other. The conflict had become a cancer that was consuming both civilizations from within, yet neither could find a way to end it without admitting defeat. The beginning of the end came when both sides simultaneously reached the same terrible conclusion that only the complete annihilation of their enemies could ensure their own survival. The Dragonborn began preparing the ritual of final purification, a working that would call upon the power of every metallic dragon that had ever lived to scour the earth clean of infernal taint. The Tieflings responded by drafting the ultimate contract, an agreement that would bind every devil in hell to a single coordinated assault upon the mortal world. Neither ritual was ever completed, for both empires collapsed under the weight of their own ambitions before they could bring their final weapons to bear. The resources required for such massive workings had drained both civilizations past the point of sustainability. Rebellions broke out in distant provinces that could no longer be effectively controlled. Ancient allies withdrew their support rather than be dragged down by the endless conflict. Even the dragons and devils that had initially supported their respective sides began to question whether the price of victory was worth paying. The formal end of the Tarathi Wars came not with a climactic battle or grand treaty, but with a whimper of exhaustion. Both empires simply lacked the strength to continue fighting, their populations decimated, their treasuries empty, their lands scarred by magical weapons that had rendered vast territories uninhabitable. The final ceasefire agreement was a hastily drafted document that satisfied no one but allowed both sides to pretend they had achieved their objectives. In the aftermath of the war, both Arcosia and Baal Tarath entered periods of rapid decline from which they would never recover. The Dragonborn found their floating cities falling from the sky, as the magical infrastructure required to maintain them could no longer be supported. The Tieflings discovered that their infernal contracts had made them so dependent upon diabolic support that they could not function independently. When their otherworldly patrons grew weary of the conflict, the scattered survivors of both civilizations wandered the world like ghosts of their former glory, carrying with them the bitter knowledge that they had possessed wonders beyond imagination and had thrown them away in pursuit of an enemy that had never threatened anything more than their pride. The great libraries burned, the floating cities crashed into ruins, and the accumulated wisdom of millennia was lost in the space of a few short generations. Yet, perhaps the greatest tragedy of the Tarathi Wars was not the destruction of two great civilizations, but the lesson that subsequent peoples drew from their fate. Rather than seeing the conflict as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing pride and prejudice to override wisdom and restraint, many chose to interpret it as proof that different ways of life could never coexist peacefully, that tolerance was weakness, and that the only safety lay in the complete destruction of all potential rivals. The ashes of Arcosia and Tarathi became the foundations upon which later empires built their own doctrines of racial superiority and religious intolerance. The memory of Dragonborn noble idealism and tiefling pragmatic cunning was distorted into caricatures that served the political needs of those who had never known either people personally. The complex reality of two sophisticated civilizations destroying each other through mutual pride and misunderstanding was simplified into a morality tale about good versus evil that missed the deeper truths entirely. And so we see that the greatest wars are not fought over territory or treasure, but over competing visions of what the world should be. The Tarathi Wars remind us that even the most noble ideals can become destructive when coupled with the assumption that those who think differently are necessarily inferior, and that even the most sophisticated societies can fall victim to the ancient human failing of believing that might makes right. In the ruins of their conflict we find not vindication for either side, but a warning about the price of allowing pride to override wisdom, and the terrible cost of choosing destruction over the difficult work of learning to coexist with those whose fundamental nature differs from our own. Chapter 4. The Dragonborn Diaspora. Exile teaches hard lessons that prosperity never can, stripping away all illusions about one's place in the world, and revealing the true strength that lies beneath the gilded surface of privilege. When the floating cities of Arcosia fell from the sky like dying stars, their crystal spires shattering against the unyielding earth, the Dragonborn faced a truth that their ancestors could never have imagined, that heritage alone is not enough to sustain a people, and that even the blood of dragons can grow cold when separated from the fires that first kindled it. The fall of the last great sky city Vortamil marked the end not merely of an empire but of an entire way of life. Those Dragonborn who had survived the long war with Tarathi found themselves suddenly homeless, in a world that remembered them only as the prideful lords of crystal palaces, the aloof masters who had once looked down upon the earthbound peoples from their cloud-touching heights. Now they walked the same roads as common refugees, their scales dulled by dust and sorrow, their proud bearing bent beneath the weight of loss and uncertainty. The great clans that had once ruled continents from floating thrones scattered like leaves before an autumn wind, each family group seeking survival wherever they could find it. Some turned eastward toward the rising sun, hoping to find lands untouched by the devastation of the war. Others fled westward to the great ocean, trusting their fate to waters that might carry them to distant shores where the name of Arcosia was unknown. Still others went north into the frozen wastes, believing that the harsh cold might forge their scattered people into something stronger than they had been in the days of easy prosperity. The clan of the Brass Wing, once masters of the great libraries of Vor Kragel, found themselves in the desert lands beyond the Thornwall Mountains, their precious books and scrolls reduced to ashes in their flight from the burning cities. Patriarch Thessarian the Learned, whose knowledge of ancient Draconic lore had once made him advisor to emperors, now led his people in learning the harsh lessons of desert survival: how to find water in barren stone, how to navigate by stars when no landmarks remained, how to trade knowledge for bread when wisdom had lost its value in a world that cared only for immediate necessities. In those first bitter years of exile, many of the traditional Dragonborn customs seemed like cruel mockeries of their former glory. The rite of scale blessing, once performed in crystal temples that caught the light of dawn, and held it throughout the day, was now conducted around smoky campfires that offered more shadow than illumination. The ancient songs of Draconic heritage, originally sung in the harmonic chambers of floating palaces, where the very walls amplified their voices into celestial chorus, now echoed hollowly in crude shelters built from whatever materials the wilderness provided. Yet, it was precisely in these moments of greatest desperation that the true strength of the Dragonborn character began to reveal itself. Stripped of their magical cities, and deprived of their technological marvels, they discovered resources within themselves that generations of prosperity had left untapped. The breath weapons that had once powered great engines of war now served to forge simple tools and provide warmth for cold children. The draconic pride that had contributed to their empire's downfall was tempered into a quiet dignity that refused to bow before hardship or accept charity as anything more than temporary necessity. The clan of the Silver Sword, led by the warrior matriarch Seraphina Battleheart, established themselves in the hill country south of what had once been the Tarathi border. Finding the land populated by human tribes who viewed all strangers with suspicion, Seraphina faced a choice that would have been unthinkable in the days of empire. She could attempt to conquer these peoples as her ancestors might have done, or she could find a way to earn their acceptance through service rather than dominance. The choice she made would become a model for Dragonborn communities throughout the Diaspora. Rather than demanding recognition of their natural superiority, Seraphina's people offered their skills as protectors and teachers, using their martial prowess to defend human settlements from bandits and monsters, while sharing their knowledge of metalworking and magical theory. In exchange, they asked only for the right to build their own communities nearby, maintaining their cultural traditions while contributing to the broader welfare of the region. This delicate balance between assimilation and preservation became the central challenge of Dragonborn survival in the post-imperial age. They could not simply continue as they had before, for the world would not support isolated communities of proud warriors who contributed nothing to the societies around them. Yet neither could they abandon their heritage entirely, for without their connection to their draconic ancestors, they risked becoming merely another human variant, rather than a people with their own unique destiny. The solution, developed independently by scattered communities across the known world, was what came to be called the path of earned honor. Rather than claiming superiority based on their bloodline, Dragonborn would prove their worth through deed and service. Rather than demanding recognition of their ancient achievements, they would create new accomplishments that served the needs of their current neighbors. Rather than living apart in proud isolation, they would become integral parts of the communities they joined while maintaining the essential elements of their own culture. In the northern wastes, the clan of the Copper Shield found themselves among the hardy folk of the frozen shore, a people who had learned to thrive in conditions that would have killed softer populations. The Dragonborn discovered that their fire-breathing abilities made them invaluable in this harsh environment, capable of melting ice for drinking water, warming shelters during the worst storms, and forging metal tools even in the depths of winter. In return, they learned the indigenous techniques for hunting, food preservation, and wilderness survival that their former urban existence had never required. The cultural exchange that resulted transformed both peoples in ways that neither had anticipated. The Dragonborn adapted their traditional crafting techniques to work with the materials available in the Arctic environment, creating new art forms that combined their draconic heritage with the practical aesthetics of their adopted home. The human tribes, meanwhile, incorporated Dragonborn military tactics and magical knowledge into their own traditions, developing hybrid fighting styles that made them formidable opponents for any who threatened their territory. Yet perhaps the most significant changes occurred in the children born to these mixed communities. The young Dragonborn, raised among human playmates and educated in both cultural traditions, developed a flexibility and adaptability that their pure-blooded ancestors had often lacked. They learned to see their draconic heritage not as a mark of inherent superiority, but as a responsibility to use their gifts in service to the greater good. They grew up thinking of themselves not as displaced nobles waiting to reclaim their thrones, but but as integral members of whatever community had offered them shelter and acceptance. The clan of the Bronze Scale faced perhaps the greatest challenge of all when they sought refuge in the elven territories of the Autumn Court. The immortal elves had long memories and little sympathy for the former lords of Arcosia, whom they remembered as arrogant upstarts, who had believed that technological achievement could substitute for true wisdom. The Dragonborn refugees found themselves welcomed with a politeness so cold it felt more hostile than open rejection. Matriarch Velkanith, the Truth Seeker, realizing that her people's survival depended upon earning genuine respect rather than grudging tolerance, made a decision that shocked even her own followers. She formally renounced all claims to the titles and privileges that her clan had held in the Old Empire, declaring that they would enter elven society as students rather than refugees, willing to learn whatever wisdom their hosts were willing to share. This act of humility, performed before the assembled Court of Seasons, broke through the elven reserve in a way that no display of power or recitation of ancient achievements could have managed. The elves, who valued wisdom above all other virtues, recognized in this gesture something they had never expected to see from Dragonborn, the beginning of true understanding. What followed was a period of cultural apprenticeship that lasted for decades, as the displaced Dragonborn slowly earned the right to be considered not just tolerated guests, but valued members of the elven community. The knowledge they gained during this period proved invaluable, not only to their own survival, but to the preservation of Dragonborn culture throughout the Diaspora. Elven archival techniques allowed them to preserve oral traditions that might otherwise have been lost, while Elven philosophy provided new frameworks for understanding their relationship to both their Draconic heritage and their current circumstances. When members of the Bronze Scale eventually left the Autumn Court to establish new communities elsewhere, they carried with them hybrid traditions that combined the best elements of both cultures. Not all Dragonborn communities succeeded in finding such accommodating hosts, or in making such successful adaptations. The clan of the Iron Fang, driven by memories of their former military glory, attempted to establish themselves as mercenaries and sellswords, offering their combat skills to whatever lord would pay them. While this approach provided short-term survival, it trapped them in a cycle of violence that gradually eroded the cultural values that had once made their people great. Without the stabilizing influence of permanent homes and lasting relationships, the Iron Fang Dragonborn began to lose touch with the philosophical traditions that had distinguished them from mere warriors. Their children grew up knowing how to fight, but not why they fought, understanding the mechanics of their breath weapons, but not the spiritual significance that their ancestors had attached to these gifts. By the third generation, they had become little more than particularly effective soldiers for hire, their Draconic heritage reduced to a set of useful biological adaptations rather than a source of meaning and identity. The fate of the Iron Fang served as a cautionary tale for other Dragonborn communities, illustrating the dangers of allowing practical survival to completely override cultural preservation. It became clear that maintaining their identity required more than simply continuing to exist. It demanded active effort to pass on not just the techniques and knowledge of their ancestors, but the values and purposes that had given that knowledge meaning. This realization led to the development of the Keeper tradition, a system by which each Dragonborn community designated certain individuals to serve as living repositories of their people's history and culture. These keepers were trained not only in the practical skills necessary for survival, but in the oral traditions, philosophical teachings, and spiritual practices that connected their people to their Draconic ancestors. They became the guardians of memory in a world that seemed determined to forget the achievements of the past. The Keepers faced the enormous challenge of adapting ancient traditions to vastly changed circumstances while preserving their essential meaning and significance. The great ceremonies that had once been performed in crystal temples now had to be conducted in simple wooden buildings or even outdoors under the open sky. The complex hierarchies that had governed Arcosian society had to be simplified to fit the needs of small, scattered communities. The magical techniques that had once relied on the infrastructure of a great empire had to be modified to work with whatever resources were locally available. Yet, in meeting these challenges, the keepers and the communities they served discovered something that their imperial ancestors had never known: that true strength lies not in external magnificence, but in the ability to preserve what matters most, even when everything else has been stripped away. The Dragonborn Diaspora forced them to distinguish between the essential and the merely ornamental, between the traditions that defined them and the customs that had simply accumulated over time. The scattered communities began to develop new forms of connection with each other, creating networks of communication and mutual support that spanned vast distances. Traveling merchants who carried goods between settlements also carried news, messages, and cultural innovations, ensuring that no community remained completely isolated. Young adults often spent years visiting other Dragonborn settlements, learning different adaptations of their shared heritage and bringing new ideas back to their birth communities. These exchanges led to what scholars would later call the Great Synthesis, a period during which the various Dragonborn communities shared their discoveries and innovations, creating new traditions that were stronger and more flexible than what any single group could have developed in isolation. The harsh lessons of survival in hostile environments were balanced by the cultural preservation efforts of more stable communities. The philosophical insights gained through interaction with other peoples were combined with the practical skills developed through necessity. The result was a transformed Dragonborn culture that retained its essential character while becoming more adaptable, more inclusive, and more resilient than its imperial predecessor had ever been. The proud isolation that had contributed to Arcosia's downfall was replaced by a pragmatic willingness to learn from others while still maintaining their own unique identity. The assumption of natural superiority gave way to a commitment to earn respect through service and achievement. Perhaps most significantly, the Dragonborn of the Diaspora developed a new understanding of what it meant to carry Draconic blood. Rather than seeing their heritage as a guarantee of dominance over lesser peoples, they came to view it as a responsibility to serve as bridges between different cultures and communities. Their breath weapons became tools of creation rather than destruction. Their natural leadership abilities were exercised in service to the common good, and their connection to ancient wisdom was used to solve present problems rather than dwell on past glories. As the scattered communities began to stabilize and prosper in their new homes, they faced yet another challenge: the question of what their ultimate destiny should be. Some dreamed of eventually reuniting all Dragonborn under a single banner and rebuilding their lost empire in a new form. Others believed that their future lay in permanent integration with the other peoples of the world, maintaining their cultural identity, but abandoning any ambition to political independence. The debate over these different visions would continue for generations, shaping the development of Dragonborn society in ways that are still evident today. Yet, perhaps the most important lesson of the Diaspora period was that survival alone is not enough, that a people must have not only the will to endure, but a clear understanding of what they are enduring for, and a vision of what they hope to become in the process. The Dragonborn Diaspora stands as testament to the truth that adversity, while painful, can also be transformative. In losing their empire, the Dragonborn gained something far more valuable: the knowledge that their true strength lay not in their cities or their technologies, but in their character and their commitment to the values that made them who they were. Scattered across the world like seeds on the wind, they discovered that their heritage could take root in any soil, growing into new forms while retaining its essential nature. Chapter 5. Breath of the Ancestors. The soul remembers what the mind forgets, carrying within it echoes of power that transcend the boundaries of individual existence. For the Dragonborn, this truth manifests most clearly in the moment when they first feel the ancestral fire stirring within their throats, when the breath of their draconic forebears awakens in their mortal frames and connects them to a lineage that stretches back to the very foundations of creation. It is a power that cannot be taught or learned, only inherited and awakened, a gift that links each Dragonborn to the eternal essence of dragonkind itself. The breath weapon of a Dragonborn is far more than a simple biological adaptation or martial technique. It is the physical manifestation of their spiritual connection to the great dragons who shaped their bloodline countless generations ago. When a young dragonborn first exhales flame or frost, acid or lightning, they are not merely demonstrating a racial ability, but participating in a sacred communion that bridges the gap between mortal flesh and draconic divinity. In that moment, they become conduits for powers that dwarf their individual existence, vessels through which the ancient strength of their ancestors can touch the present world. The awakening of breath typically occurs during the tumultuous years of adolescence, when the dragonborn body undergoes the complex changes that mark the transition from childhood to adulthood. Yet the timing and nature of this awakening varies dramatically from individual to individual, influenced by factors that dragonborn sages have studied for millennia without fully understanding. Some children manifest their breath as early as their 7th year, while others may not experience the awakening until well into their 2nd decade of life. Young Cassandra Emberheart was 12 when her fire first bloomed, sitting in the kitchen of her family's modest inn in the human settlement of Millbrook. She had been helping her mother prepare the evening meal when an argument with her younger brother caused her temper to flare beyond all previous bounds. The frustrated shout that burst from her lips carried with it a gout of flame that instantly incinerated the wooden spoon in her hand and left scorch marks on the stone hearth behind it. The terror in her brother's eyes was matched only by the sudden overwhelming sense of connection she felt to something vast and ancient that seemed to stretch back through countless generations of her bloodline. Her grandmother, matriarch Thessa of the Bronze Scale, had been expecting this moment for years. She immediately took Cassandra aside, away from the frightened humans who were still trying to understand what they had witnessed, and began the first of the teaching sessions that would help the girl understand and control her newfound ability. But more than mere technique was involved in these lessons. Thessa was passing on a spiritual tradition that connected her granddaughter to the accumulated wisdom of all their ancestors. The breath weapon, Thessa explained, was not simply fire made manifest, but the physical expression of the inner flame that burned within all dragonborn, the spark of draconic essence that made them more than human, the divine inheritance that carried with it both tremendous power and equally tremendous responsibility. To breathe fire was to partake in the creative force that had forged the world itself, to become momentarily one with the cosmic energies that had shaped reality from primordial chaos. Each type of breath weapon carries its own spiritual significance, reflecting different aspects of the draconic nature and connecting the wielder to different traditions of power and purpose. Those who breathe fire inherit the legacy of the gold and red dragons, partaking in the dual nature of flame as both destroyer and creator, the force that can reduce mighty works to ash or forge new wonders from raw materials. Fire breathers often find themselves drawn to leadership roles, their passionate natures and natural charisma making them effective at inspiring others and driving forward ambitious projects. The acid breathers trace their lineage to the black and copper dragons, their corrosive breath reflecting the inexorable power of time and change that dissolves even the strongest barriers and most enduring monuments. They tend toward contemplative natures, understanding instinctively that destruction and creation are merely different aspects of the same fundamental force. Their breath teaches the lesson that all things must pass, but that from the dissolution of the old, new possibilities can emerge. Those blessed or cursed with lightning breath carry the essence of the blue and bronze dragons, their electrical discharge connecting them to the raw energy that powers both storms and thoughts, the force that animates all living things and drives the complex machinery of existence itself. Lightning breathers often become scholars and inventors, their minds crackling with the same energy that leaps from their throats, their thoughts moving with the swift intensity of the electrical currents they command. The cold breathers inherit the patrimony of the white and silver dragons, their freezing exhalation representing not mere absence of heat, but the presence of a force that can preserve as well as destroy, that can create crystalline beauty from shapeless water, or reduce the most complex structures to brittle fragments. They often serve as keepers of tradition and memory, their naturally preservative natures making them ideal guardians of ancient knowledge and cultural continuity. The Poison Brothers, rarest among Dragonborn, carry the legacy of the Green Dragons, their toxic breath reflecting the complex relationship between life and death, healing and harm, medicine and venom. They understand instinctively that the same substance can serve as either cure or poison depending upon dosage and application, and they often become healers, alchemists, or advisors who specialize in navigating the subtle dangers that threaten communities from within. Yet the spiritual significance of the breath weapon extends far beyond its immediate practical applications or its connection to specific draconic lineages. The very act of breathing forth elemental force serves as a constant reminder to the Dragonborn of their dual nature, mortal in body, but carrying divine essence within their souls, earthbound in their daily lives, but connected to powers that span the cosmos itself. Each time they exhale flame or frost, they are performing a minor miracle that links them directly to the fundamental forces of creation. The clan totems that adorn Dragonborn communities represent far more than simple symbols of tribal identity. They are physical anchors for the spiritual connections that bind the community to their draconic ancestors. Carved from materials that have been touched by dragon breath and inscribed with runes that channel ancestral power, these totems serve as focal points for the collective memory and shared identity of the clan. During important ceremonies, the totems actually glow with inner light, responding to the concentrated breath weapons of the assembled community members and creating a visible manifestation of their spiritual unity. The clan of the Sapphire Wing maintains perhaps the most elaborate totem complex in the known world, a collection of crystal formations that have been growing for over 1,000 years in the hidden valley they call home. Each crystal corresponds to a different ancestor, and the breath of living clan members causes specific crystals to resonate with harmonic frequencies that tell the stories of their forebears. A skilled totem reader can discern the history of the entire clan by interpreting the patterns of light and sound that emerge when the crystals are properly activated. The rituals surrounding breath weapon mastery form the core of Dragonborn's spiritual practice, serving multiple functions within their communities. They provide practical training that helps young Dragonborn learn to control their dangerous abilities, offer psychological support during the difficult transition to adulthood, and create opportunities for the transmission of cultural values and historical knowledge from one generation to the next. Most importantly, they establish the spiritual framework that will guide the individual throughout their adult life. The rite of first breath marks the formal recognition of a young Dragonborn's awakening power. The candidate stands before the assembled community and demonstrates their ability to produce a controlled breath weapon, proving that they have achieved the minimum level of mastery necessary for safe participation in clan activities. But the true significance of the ceremony lies not in this demonstration of technique, but in the words of acknowledgement spoken by the clan elders, formally welcoming the young adult into the community of those who carry draconic essence. Following the initial recognition comes a period of intensive training known as the Season of Learning Flame, during which the newly awakened Dragonborn studies under the guidance of experienced mentors who help them develop both technical skill and spiritual understanding. They learn not only how to control the intensity and direction of their breath, but also the philosophical principles that govern its proper use. They study the histories of their ancestors, learning how previous generations employed their gifts in service to their communities and the broader world. The culmination of this training period is the Ordeal of Ancestral Memory, a ritual that requires the candidate to spend 3 days and nights in meditation while breathing upon a sacred crystal that has been passed down through countless generations. The crystal, known as a memory stone, has absorbed fragments of the spiritual essence of every Dragonborn who has ever touched it with their breath, creating a repository of ancestral wisdom that can be accessed by those who achieve the proper state of spiritual receptivity. During the ordeal, candidates often experience vivid visions of their ancestors' lives, witnessing great moments of triumph and tragedy that shaped their bloodline's destiny. They may see the first Dragonborn receiving their transformation from ancient dragons, witness the glory days of Arcosia's floating cities, experience the devastation of the Tarathi wars, or share in the struggles of the Diaspora period. These visions serve multiple purposes. They provide historical education, create emotional connections to ancestral heritage, and help the individual understand their place within the continuing story of their people. Thorak Ironbreath underwent his ordeal of ancestral memory in the depths of a mountain cave sacred to his clan, breathing upon a memory stone that had been carved from the heart of a meteorite that fell during the early days of Arcosia. For 3 days, he experienced flashes of ancestral consciousness, seeing through the eyes of warriors who had fought in the Great War, scholars who had preserved ancient knowledge through the dark years of exile, and common folk who had struggled to maintain their dignity and identity in foreign lands. The most powerful vision came on the final night, when he found himself experiencing the memories of Baracus the Truth Seeker, a distant ancestor who had served as a diplomat during the early contacts with Baal Tarath. Through Baracus's eyes, Thorak witnessed the gradual breakdown of negotiations, felt the growing tension and mutual incomprehension that would eventually lead to centuries of warfare, and understood viscerally how pride and prejudice could transform potential allies into bitter enemies. When Thorak emerged from the ordeal, he carried with him not only the technical knowledge of breath weapon mastery, but a deep understanding of the moral responsibilities that came with his inherited power. He had learned that strength without wisdom leads to destruction, that heritage without humility breeds arrogance, and that the greatest honors are won not through dominance, but through service to ideals greater than oneself. The ongoing practice of breath weapon meditation forms the foundation of daily spiritual life for observant Dragonborn. Each morning, they perform the greeting of the dawn, a ceremonial exhalation that both honors their ancestors and prepares their bodies and minds for the challenges of the coming day. The specific form of this greeting varies, depending upon the individual's breath type and clan traditions, but the underlying purpose remains constant: to maintain conscious connection to their Draconic heritage and to dedicate their inherited gifts to worthy purposes. Evening meditation follows a similar pattern, with the farewell to the sun serving as both a review of the day's accomplishments and failures and a request for ancestral guidance in making better choices in the future. Advanced practitioners often extend these sessions into hours-long meditations that can produce profound spiritual insights and occasionally even limited prophetic visions of possible futures. The communal breath ceremonies that mark important occasions in Dragonborn society represent the most spectacular demonstrations of their spiritual traditions. During these events, dozens or even hundreds of clan members coordinate their breath weapons to create displays of elemental force that can be seen for miles. But these spectacles serve purposes far beyond mere entertainment. They are expressions of community unity, demonstrations of collective power, and invocations that call upon ancestral spirits to bless important undertakings. The Festival of Unified Flame, celebrated annually by many Dragonborn communities, requires participants to synchronize their breathing so perfectly that their individual breath weapons merge into a single, coordinated display. The successful completion of this ceremony is believed to ensure prosperity and protection for the coming year, while failure is interpreted as a warning that the community has lost spiritual cohesion and must work to restore harmony among its members. Yet perhaps the most profound aspect of Dragonborn breath weapon spirituality lies in its emphasis on the concept of inherited responsibility. Unlike magical abilities that are learned through study or granted by external forces, the breath weapon is an integral part of the Dragonborn's essential nature, as much a part of them as their heartbeat or their thoughts. This intimate connection to their power creates a corresponding obligation to use it wisely and for purposes that honor the ancestors who made such gifts possible. The philosophical framework that governs proper breath weapon use is complex and nuanced, requiring practitioners to consider not only the immediate effects of their actions, but also their long-term consequences for their communities and their people as a whole. The breath that can forge tools can also destroy homes. The flame that can warm the cold can also consume the innocent. The power that can protect the weak can also oppress the vulnerable. Learning to navigate these moral complexities is considered as important as mastering the technical aspects of breath control. The code of ancestral honor that guides Dragonborn conduct includes specific provisions regarding breath weapon use, establishing clear guidelines about when such power may be employed and for what purposes. Defensive use is always permitted and often required, particularly when protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Creative applications that serve community needs are encouraged, whether in crafting, construction, or other productive endeavors. Offensive use requires careful justification and is governed by strict rules of proportionality and necessity. Violations of these guidelines are considered among the most serious offenses possible within Dragonborn society, tantamount to betraying not only one's community, but one's entire ancestral lineage. The punishment for deliberate misuse of breath weapons traditionally involves temporary exile and spiritual purification rituals designed to restore the offender's connection to proper principles. In extreme cases, repeat offenders may be subjected to the ceremony of breath binding, a ritual that temporarily suppresses their ability to manifest their draconic heritage until they can demonstrate genuine repentance and reform. As Dragonborn communities have adapted to life among other peoples, the spiritual traditions surrounding breath weapons have evolved to address new challenges and opportunities. The presence of non-Dragonborn neighbors who may not understand the significance of these abilities has required the development of new protocols for their appropriate use in mixed communities. The availability of new materials and techniques has opened up possibilities for creative applications that the ancient traditions never contemplated. Yet, through all these changes, the fundamental truth remains constant, that the breath of the ancestors flows through each Dragonborn, connecting them to a heritage that transcends individual existence and binds them to purposes larger than personal ambition. In learning to control and properly employ their breath weapons, they learn also to control and properly employ themselves, becoming worthy vessels for the ancient power that courses through their veins and the eternal wisdom that guides their steps. The breath of dragons is the breath of creation itself, the force that shaped the world from primordial chaos and continues to drive the ongoing process of transformation and renewal. In carrying this power within their mortal frames, the Dragonborn become partners in the cosmic work of creation, responsible for using their inherited gifts to build rather than destroy, to unite rather than divide, to honor the past while working toward a better future. Their breath weapons are not merely tools of war or instruments of survival, but sacred trusts that connect them to the deepest mysteries of existence and the highest possibilities of mortal achievement. Chapter 6. The Platinum Cadre. Redemption is the most difficult victory to achieve, for it requires defeating not an external enemy, but the darkness within one's own soul, transforming guilt into purpose and shame into strength. In the aftermath of Arcosia's fall, when the scattered Dragonborn faced not only physical exile, but spiritual crisis over their role in the catastrophic war with Baal Tarathi, a chosen few heard a calling that would reshape their understanding of what it meant to carry draconic blood. They became the Platinum Cadre, servants of Bahamut the Platinum Dragon, devoted to proving that the children of dragons could serve justice rather than pride, protection rather than conquest. The origins of the Platinum Cadre trace back to a single moment of divine intervention during the darkest days of the Diaspora. Seradith Truescale, a former general of the Arcosian military, whose tactical genius had won a dozen battles, but whose conscience had been shattered by the countless lives lost in service to imperial pride, knelt in the ruins of what had once been the Temple of Ascending Flame. The crystal spires lay broken around her, like the fragments of a shattered dream, and in her heart burned a guilt so intense it seemed to consume her from within. She had followed orders, served her empire with distinction, and earned honors that now felt like chains of shame, binding her to deeds she could never undo. The breath weapon that had once filled her with pride now seemed like a curse, a reminder of all the destruction she had wrought in service to causes that had proven hollow. In her despair she cried out to any power that might be listening, begging for a chance to atone for the blood on her hands and the ashes of her people's glory. The answer came not as words, but as presence, a warmth that filled the ruined temple and drove back the shadows that had gathered in its broken chambers. Bahamut himself materialized before her, not in his full draconic majesty, but in the form he often took when walking among mortals, an elderly human man whose eyes held depths of ancient wisdom and infinite compassion. His voice, when he spoke, carried the authority of divine law tempered by the gentleness of perfect understanding. "Child of my blood," the Platinum Dragon said, "you mourn for deeds done in service to false pride, yet your sorrow proves that your soul remains uncorrupted by the darkness that consumed your empire. Rise, and let your grief become the foundation of new purpose. Your people have fallen far from the ideals I hoped they would embody, but in you I see the possibility of redemption, not just for yourself, but for all who carry Draconic heritage." From that moment, Seradeth became the first of the Platinum Cadre, sworn to serve not the ambitions of empire, but the eternal principles of justice, mercy, and protection of the innocent. Bahamut's blessing transformed her, not in body but in spirit, filling her with divine purpose that burned away her despair and replaced it with an unshakable commitment to atonement through service. Her silver scales took on a platinum luster that marked her as one of the chosen, and her breath weapon became not merely cold but a cleansing frost that could purify corruption and heal the wounds left by darker magics. Word of Seradeth's transformation spread through the scattered Dragonborn communities like wildfire, carrying with it both hope and challenge. Some dismissed her claims as the delusions of a mind broken by guilt and loss, while others saw in her example the possibility of reclaiming their people's honor through nobler means. Those who felt the same crushing weight of collective shame that had driven Seradeth to her knees began to make pilgrimages to wherever she might be found, seeking their own chance at redemption through divine service. The second to join the Cadre was Thorax Goldenheart, a young Dragonborn whose parents had died in the final siege of Vor Kragel. He had spent his childhood years burning with hatred for the tieflings who had taken everything from him, training obsessively in combat techniques and military strategy, with the single-minded goal of someday leading a war of vengeance that would restore his people's glory. But when he finally encountered Seradeth and heard her speak of redemption rather than revenge, something fundamental shifted within his understanding of what strength truly meant. Under Seradeth's guidance, Thorax learned to transform his rage into righteous indignation, his desire for vengeance into a commitment to justice, his tactical brilliance into a tool for protecting the innocent rather than destroying enemies. The golden sheen of his scales deepened into true platinum as he took the sacred oaths that bound him to Bahamut's service, and his fire breath became a golden flame that could burn away illusions and falsehoods while leaving truth unharmed. As the Cadre grew in numbers, its members developed the organizational structure and philosophical framework that would guide their order through the centuries to come. They were not merely paladins in the traditional sense, but something more complex, part military order, part monastic community, part wandering knights-errant dedicated to proving through deed and sacrifice that the Dragonborn heritage could be a force for good in the world. The initiation rituals of the Platinum Cadre required candidates to undergo trials that tested not only their combat skills and magical abilities, but their moral character and spiritual commitment. The first trial, known as the Facing of Truth, required candidates to spend 7 days in solitary meditation, confronting honestly all the ways they had failed to live up to the ideals their heritage demanded. They had to acknowledge not only their personal failings, but their share in the collective guilt that all Dragonborn carried for their people's role in the devastating war with Baal Tarathi. Many candidates failed this first trial, unable to bear the weight of complete honesty about their own moral shortcomings. Those who persevered discovered that acknowledging their failures was not an ending but a beginning, the foundation upon which genuine redemption could be built. They emerged from their week of solitude, humbled but not broken, aware of their limitations, but committed to transcending them through service to something greater than themselves. The second trial, the test of sacrifice, required candidates to give up something precious to them in service to strangers who could offer nothing in return. Some surrendered family heirlooms to purchase food for the hungry, others abandoned personal ambitions to care for the sick and injured. Still others devoted months or years to protecting communities that had initially viewed them with suspicion and fear. The specific nature of the sacrifice mattered less than the willingness to place the needs of others before their own desires and comfort. The final trial, the ordeal of platinum fire, could only be administered by Bahamut himself, or by one of his most trusted servants. Candidates were required to subject themselves to the direct touch of divine energy, allowing Bahamut's essence to examine every corner of their souls and judge their worthiness to serve as instruments of his will. The experience was described by survivors as simultaneously terrifying and exalting, a complete dissolution of individual identity, followed by reconstruction according to divine purpose. Those who successfully completed all three trials emerged as full members of the Platinum Cadre, their scales bearing the distinctive platinum sheen that marked them as Bahamut's chosen servants. More importantly, they carried within themselves an unshakable commitment to the principles that would guide their actions for the rest of their lives. Justice tempered by mercy, strength exercised in protection of the weak, and pride transformed into humble service to the greater good. The code of platinum honor that governed Cadre behavior was more demanding than any secular law or military regulation. Members were forbidden from seeking personal glory or material reward for their actions, required to offer aid to any who requested it regardless of their ability to pay, and bound to forgive their enemies while never forgetting the lessons that past conflicts had taught. They could not own property beyond what was necessary for their immediate needs, could not marry or start families that might divide their loyalty to their divine mission, and could not retreat from danger when innocent lives hung in the balance. Yet for all its restrictions, membership in the Cadre offered compensations that no worldly position could match. The divine blessing that flowed through their transformed bodies made them stronger, faster, and more resilient than ordinary Dragonborn, while their connection to Bahamut granted them access to magical abilities that transcended the normal limitations of mortal flesh. Their breath weapons became instruments of divine will, capable of effects that seemed miraculous to those who witnessed them. Brother Kazeth's Stormwing discovered the true extent of these gifts during a plague outbreak in the human city of Milford, where his lightning breath proved capable of purifying contaminated water sources and destroying the disease-carrying vermin that had spread the contagion. Sister Morwen Frostblade learned that her freezing exhalation could preserve food stores during famines and create barriers of ice that protected refugees from pursuing enemies. Each Cadre member developed unique applications of their enhanced abilities, always finding new ways to serve the needs of those they had sworn to protect. The wandering lifestyle adopted by most Cadre members reflected their commitment to taking their redemptive mission wherever it was most needed. They traveled constantly, seeking out places where injustice flourished or where the innocent suffered without protection. Their arrival in a troubled community was often greeted with suspicion, for the reputation of Dragonborn had been tarnished by their people's role in ancient conflicts, but their actions invariably spoke louder than prejudice. In the border town of Ravenscroft, Brother Thalasar arrived to find the population terrorized by a band of brigands who had been extorting protection money while offering no actual protection from the monsters that plagued the surrounding wilderness. The local authorities were either corrupted by bribes or intimidated by threats, leaving the common people with no recourse against their oppressors. Thalasar's response was swift and decisive. He challenged the brigand leader to single combat, staking his own life against the freedom of the town. The fight that followed became legend in the region, not for its violence, but for its demonstration of mercy and victory. When Thalasar's superior skill and divine blessing gave him the upper hand, he offered his defeated opponent a choice between death and redemption: join the Cadre and seek atonement through service, or face the consequences of a lifetime of predation. The brigand leader's acceptance of redemption led to the conversion of his entire band, transforming a source of terror into a force for protection almost overnight. Such dramatic conversions were not uncommon in the early days of the Cadre, when the power of their example could inspire even hardened criminals to seek better paths. The sight of Dragonborn, using their formidable abilities to protect rather than dominate, to serve rather than rule, challenged assumptions about the nature of power and strength that had persisted for centuries. Communities that had learned to fear the approach of dragon-blooded warriors began to welcome them as harbingers of justice and hope. The relationship between the Platinum Cadre and other Dragonborn communities was complex and often strained. Many traditional Dragonborn viewed the Cadre's philosophy as a betrayal of their proud heritage, a surrender to weakness disguised as virtue. They argued that accepting collective guilt for their ancestors' actions was pointless self-flagellation, that the Dragonborn had nothing to apologize for in defending their empire against Tarathi aggression, and that seeking redemption implied they had done something wrong in the first place. These philosophical disagreements sometimes erupted into open conflict when Cadre members encountered Dragonborn, who still clung to the old imperial attitudes. The clan of the Red Talon, a community of Dragonborn mercenaries who had established themselves as the ruling class in a small human kingdom, viewed the arrival of Sister Viridian Truthseeker as a direct challenge to their authority and legitimacy. They demanded that she acknowledge their right to rule by virtue of their superior bloodline and cease spreading what they termed platinum poison among their subjects. Viridian's response exemplified the Cadre approach to such confrontations. Rather than challenging the Red Talon's rule directly, she began working among the common people of the kingdom, using her abilities to heal the sick, protect the vulnerable, and demonstrate through action what true leadership looked like. When the Red Talon finally moved against her, arresting her on trumped-up charges of sedition and treason, the popular uprising that followed forced them to choose between massacre and exile. The Cadre's growing influence among both Dragonborn and other peoples attracted the attention of Bahamut's eternal enemy, Tiamat, the five-headed queen. The chromatic dragon goddess viewed the Platinum Cadre as a direct threat to her own plans for her draconic children, recognizing that their philosophy of humble service contradicted everything she hoped to achieve through the Dragonborn bloodlines she claimed as her own. Her response was to begin actively recruiting Dragonborn who had been rejected by or had rejected the Cadre, offering them power and purpose through service to her darker vision. This divine rivalry manifested in the earthly conflict between the Platinum Cadre and the Crimson Covenant, a parallel organization of Dragonborn who served Tiamat's will with the same dedication that the Cadre showed to Bahamut's cause. Where the Cadre sought redemption through service and protection, the Covenant pursued glory through conquest and domination. Where Cadre members suppressed their pride in favor of humility, Covenant warriors embraced their superiority and reveled in their power over lesser beings. The philosophical and practical conflicts between these two organizations would shape Dragonborn society for centuries, creating a fundamental division that persists to this day. Every Dragonborn community, every individual who carries dragon blood, must ultimately choose between these two visions of what their heritage means and what responsibilities it entails. The choice between platinum and crimson, between service and dominance, between redemption and pride, has become the defining moral question of Dragonborn existence. Yet the Platinum Cadre's greatest achievement may not be their individual acts of heroism or their success in redeeming their people's reputation, but their demonstration that transformation is always possible. They proved that even the most tarnished legacy can be polished to new brilliance through genuine commitment to change, that guilt can become the foundation for growth, and that the greatest victories are won not over external enemies, but over the darkness within one's own soul. In every Cadre member who trades personal ambition for divine service, we see reflected the possibility that any being can transcend their origins and become something greater than they were born to be. Their platinum scales catch the light, not as ornaments of beauty, but as symbols of purification, reminders that even the most precious metals must be refined through fire before they achieve their true luster. The breath that once served pride now serves justice. The strength that once enforced dominion now protects the innocent, and the heritage that once divided now unites all who choose to see past surface differences to the common spark of divinity that dwells within every thinking being. The legacy of the Platinum Cadre endures not in monuments of stone or crystal, but in the changed hearts of those they have served, and the transformed understanding of what true nobility means. They remind us that redemption is not a destination but a journey, not a prize to be won, but a choice to be made anew each day, and that the greatest honor comes not from what we inherit, but from what we choose to do with the gifts we have been given. Chapter 7. Draconic Bloodlines Awaken. Magic flows where bloodlines converge, and in the deepest currents of inherited power lies the truth that some gifts skip generations like stones across water, lying dormant until the proper moment of awakening transforms the mundane into the miraculous. For most Dragonborn, their draconic heritage manifests as breath weapons and physical resilience, predictable expressions of ancient gifts flowing through well-worn channels. But in rare individuals, the ancestral power takes a different path entirely, blazing through their very essence to emerge as raw sorcery that defies all attempts at conventional understanding or control. The awakening of draconic sorcery is unlike any other magical phenomenon, for it springs not from study or pact or divine blessing, but from the sudden activation of genetic memories that have slumbered in the blood for countless generations. When the power finally stirs, it brings with it not merely the ability to cast spells, but fragments of knowledge and instinct inherited from dragons, whose names have been forgotten by history, whose deeds have become legend, whose very existence has passed into myth. Sireth Moonwhisper was 17 when her bloodline awakened, standing in the garden of her family's modest home in the human settlement of Greenhill, watching her younger sister practice the controlled breathing exercises that would eventually manifest as a proper Dragonborn breath weapon. The sight filled Sireth with the familiar ache of inadequacy that had plagued her since childhood. She was the only member of her family whose draconic heritage remained stubbornly dormant, whose throat held no trace of elemental fire or frost, whose scales lacked the lustrous quality that marked those who carried active dragon blood. The moment of awakening came without warning, triggered by nothing more dramatic than her sister's successful production of a small gout of flame. But where Sireth expected to feel only the familiar pang of envy, something else stirred within her, a vast, overwhelming presence that seemed to rise from the very core of her being. The world around her suddenly blazed with visible streams of magical energy, currents of power flowing through everything from the smallest flower to the grandest mountain, all of it somehow connected to her through bonds she had never suspected existed. When she reflexively reached out to touch one of these shimmering streams, raw magic responded to her will with an enthusiasm that bordered on violence. The garden erupted in wild growth as her untrained power fed into the life forces of every plant within 100 yards. Vines bursting from the earth to climb toward the sky, flowers blooming in colors that had no names, fruit trees bearing impossible harvests of gems instead of ordinary produce. The surge of power was intoxicating and terrifying, filling her with sensations that were simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. Her grandmother, Matriarch Thessarian of the Brass Scale, recognized the signs immediately despite never having witnessed them before. The old stories spoke of Dragonborn, who became conduits for pure draconic magic, whose bloodlines carried not merely the physical gifts of their ancestors, but actual fragments of their magical essence. Such individuals were said to be touched by the ancient dragons themselves, chosen to serve as living repositories of power that might otherwise be lost forever. But these gifts came with prices that conventional Dragonborn abilities never demanded. Where a breath weapon was a discrete, controllable ability that could be activated at will and then returned to dormancy, draconic sorcery was a constant presence that colored every aspect of the wielder's existence. Sireth found herself able to sense the emotional states of everyone around her, their feelings manifesting as visible auras that shifted and swirled with every change of mood. She could hear conversations taking place miles away when the wind was right, and her dreams became windows into possible futures that might or might not come to pass. The unpredictability of her emerging powers made normal social interaction increasingly difficult. Her emotions, always intense, now affected the physical world around her in ways that were impossible to hide. When she laughed, nearby metal objects would ring like bells in harmonious chimes. When she wept, the air itself grew thick with moisture that condensed into patterns of frost on every surface. When she became angry, which happened more and more frequently as she struggled to control abilities she barely understood, small objects would spontaneously combust, while larger ones developed stress fractures that sometimes led to catastrophic failure. The local human population, initially sympathetic to what they assumed was a delayed manifestation of normal Dragonborn abilities, grew increasingly nervous as Sirith's magic proved both more powerful and less predictable than anything they had experienced. Mothers began keeping their children indoors when she passed. Farmers worried that her presence might affect their crops in unpredictable ways, and the village council suggested perhaps she might be happier living somewhere with fewer potential targets for accidental magical discharge. Thyimar, recognizing that her granddaughter needed training that their small community could not provide, began making inquiries among the scattered Dragonborn settlements, seeking someone with knowledge of Draconic sorcery and the wisdom to guide its development. The search led eventually to Master Korvax the Stormcaller, an ancient Dragonborn, whose own bloodline awakening had occurred nearly 2 centuries earlier, and who had spent the intervening decades learning to harness powers that conventional magical theory could barely comprehend. Korvax dwelt in a tower built into the heart of a mountain, its walls carved from living stone and inscribed with runes that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. The structure itself served as a focus for his magical abilities, channeling and amplifying his connection to the draconic forces that flowed through his bloodline. When Sirith first entered his presence, she felt the familiar sensation of magical resonance, as if her untrained power was recognizing and responding to a kindred essence. The training that followed bore little resemblance to conventional magical education, where traditional wizards learned to manipulate arcane forces through careful study and precise formulae. Draconic sorcerers had to discover how to work with powers that were already part of their essential nature. Korvax's first lesson consisted of teaching Sirith to recognize the difference between her own will and the ancestral instincts that shaped her magical responses, helping her understand that she was not merely casting spells but channeling the accumulated magical knowledge of every dragon in her lineage. This recognition came with profound implications that extended far beyond mere technique. When Sirith cast a spell that summoned elemental fire, she was not simply manipulating magical energy, but participating in a ritual that connected her directly to the first gold dragon who had ever breathed flame. When she shaped raw magic into barriers of force, she was accessing defensive techniques developed by ancient metallic dragons who had fought in wars that predated mortal civilization. Every spell was simultaneously an individual act of will and a communion with ancestral spirits whose wisdom transcended individual understanding. The meditation techniques that Korvax taught were designed to help his student navigate this complex relationship between personal identity and inherited memory. Through careful breathing exercises and focused concentration, Sirith learned to enter states of consciousness where she could communicate directly with the draconic presences that dwelt within her bloodline. These ancestral spirits were not separate entities but fragments of her own essential self, aspects of her identity that had been shaped by countless generations of draconic influence. The first ancestor to make contact was Piraxis the Wise, a gold dragon whose philosophical writings had influenced Arcosian culture for centuries before his death in the early days of the Tarathi Wars. His presence manifested as a warm golden light that filled her mind with images of the floating cities in their prime, along with complex magical formulae that seemed to write themselves across her consciousness in characters of living flame. Through his guidance, Sirith began to understand that her magic was not simply power but responsibility, the obligation to use inherited wisdom in service to the same ideals that had motivated her ancestors. Yet the ancestral memories carried shadows as well as light, and not all the voices that spoke from within her bloodline offered wisdom worth following. Thyimar the Destroyer, a red dragon whose rage had consumed entire cities during the height of the ancient wars, pressed upon her consciousness with visions of magnificent devastation and the intoxicating satisfaction of absolute power. His whispers promised that she could reshape the world according to her will, that her magical abilities were proof of her inherent superiority over all lesser beings, that mercy was weakness and restraint was folly. Learning to accept the wisdom of beneficial ancestors, while rejecting the corruption of darker influences, became the central challenge of Sareth's magical education. Korvax taught her that Draconic sorcery was ultimately a test of character, a constant choice between competing visions of what power should be used for. The ancestors could offer knowledge and technique, but the moral framework that governed their application had to come from the individual sorcerer's own conscience and commitment to ethical principles. The spells available to Draconic sorcerers differed significantly from those taught in conventional magical schools, reflecting the unique nature of their power source and the specific talents of their Draconic ancestors. Where standard arcane magic emphasized precise control and reproducible effects, Draconic sorcery was characterized by raw power and intuitive casting that could produce results far beyond what the sorcerer's apparent skill level should have allowed. Tarathi discovered that her affinity lay primarily with transformation magic, spells that could alter the fundamental nature of objects and beings in ways that reflected the shape-shifting abilities of her Draconic ancestors. She could transmute base metals into precious ones, transform water into wine or poison into healing elixir, and even alter her own physical form to take on Draconic characteristics when the situation demanded. These abilities came with automatic knowledge of how to reverse their effects, preventing the catastrophic mistakes that often befell conventional transmutation specialists. Her mastery of elemental magic proved equally impressive, though it manifested in ways that conventional spellcasters found difficult to understand. Rather than summoning fire or ice through external manipulation of magical forces, she could command these elements as extensions of her own will, creating flames that burned only what she chose to destroy, or ice that provided cooling relief without causing harm. The elemental forces seemed to recognize her Draconic heritage and respond with enthusiasm that bordered on eagerness to serve. Perhaps most remarkably, Sareth developed the ability to temporarily manifest the full magical aura of her Draconic ancestors, surrounding herself with an overwhelming presence that could inspire terror in enemies while filling allies with courage and determination. During these manifestations, her voice carried the harmonic undertones of dragon speech. Her eyes blazed with inner fire, and the very air around her seemed to thrum with barely contained power. The social implications of possessing such abilities were complex and often troubling. Other Dragonborn sometimes viewed Draconic sorcerers with a mixture of awe and envy, recognizing them as inheritors of their people's greatest magical traditions, while resenting the apparent favoritism shown by fate or genetics. Human communities, already wary of Dragonborn in general, often found the unpredictable nature of Draconic sorcery deeply unsettling, leading to restrictions on where such individuals could live and practice their abilities. These tensions were exacerbated by the tendency of Draconic sorcerers to develop personality traits that reflected their ancestral influences. The gold dragon heritage that shaped Sareth's magic also imparted something of the ancient worm's natural authority and confidence, making her prone to speaking with certainty even when discussing topics she knew little about. Other sorcerers might manifest the curiosity of bronze dragons, the methodical patience of silver dragons, or the fierce independence of copper dragons, creating individuals whose personalities seemed larger than life, and sometimes difficult for ordinary people to relate to. The question of how to use such extraordinary abilities responsibly became a central concern for Draconic sorcerers throughout the Diaspora period. Many chose to follow the example of the Platinum Cadre, dedicating their powers to the service of justice and the protection of the innocent. Others became scholars and researchers, using their unique connection to draconic knowledge to preserve magical lore that might otherwise be lost. Still others turned to more practical applications, employing their abilities to solve problems that conventional magic could not address. Thyrath ultimately chose a path that combined elements of all these approaches, establishing herself as a traveling problem solver who used her abilities to address magical crises that threatened entire communities. When a portal to the elemental plane of fire opened above the city of Westbridge, threatening to incinerate everything within miles, she was able to redirect the escaping elemental energy into controlled channels that transformed the local desert into fertile farmland. When a cursed artifact began turning the population of Millhaven into crystalline statues, her transmutation abilities proved capable of reversing the effect while purifying the artifact of its malevolent influence. These achievements came at personal cost, for each major working drew heavily upon her connection to her ancestral spirits, leaving her temporarily weakened and disoriented as the borrowed knowledge faded back into the deeper levels of her consciousness. The price of channeling power, meant for beings far larger and longer lived than mortal Dragonborn, was cumulative fatigue that no amount of rest could fully alleviate, and she found herself aging more rapidly than her non-magical relatives. Yet for all its challenges and dangers, Draconic sorcery represented something unique and precious within the magical traditions of the world, a direct connection to the forces that had shaped reality itself, a bridge between mortal understanding and cosmic truth. The sorcerers who inherited these abilities became living links to a time when dragons and gods walked the earth together, when magic was not a tool to be wielded, but a fundamental aspect of existence to be participated in. The bloodlines that carry the potential for draconic sorcery are scattered throughout the Dragonborn population, like seeds in fertile soil, waiting for the proper conditions to sprout and bloom. Some families carry the potential for generations without it ever manifesting, while others see it emerge unexpectedly in individuals who show no other signs of particularly strong draconic heritage. The awakening seems to follow patterns that conventional genetics cannot explain, suggesting that magical inheritance operates according to principles that transcend purely physical heredity. Modern scholars theorize that draconic sorcery represents a form of magical evolution, an adaptation that allows the Dragonborn people to maintain their connection to their ancestral power source, even as they become increasingly integrated with other mortal societies. The abilities manifest most often in individuals who face significant challenges or crises, as if the bloodline itself responds to situations that require extraordinary solutions or capabilities beyond normal Dragonborn abilities. This pattern suggests that draconic sorcery may be more than simply a random gift or genetic accident. It may represent the conscious intervention of ancient dragon spirits who continue to guide and protect their mortal descendants from beyond the boundaries of death. The ancestors who speak through the bloodline sorcerers are not mere memories but active presences who shape the destiny of their people in ways that are both subtle and profound. As the scattered Dragonborn communities continue to adapt and evolve in their various new homes, the emergence of draconic sorcerers serves as a reminder that their people's greatest achievements may still lie ahead rather than behind them. The magic that flows through their blood carries with it not only the power of the past, but the potential for future wonders that have yet to be imagined, let alone achieved. In learning to harness these inherited abilities, while developing their own unique applications, the draconic sorcerers become pioneers of possibility, exploring frontiers of magical understanding that conventional spellcasters have never dreamed of reaching. The bloodlines awaken not to recreate the past, but to transcend it, taking the best elements of their draconic inheritance and combining them with the innovations that come from living among other peoples and facing new challenges. In this synthesis of ancient power and modern wisdom lies the hope that the Dragonborn may yet fulfill the highest aspirations of their creators, becoming not mere echoes of their draconic ancestors, but something entirely new, beings who embody the best qualities of both mortal determination and draconic might, united in service to ideals that honor the past while building toward a better future. Chapter 8. The lost city of Gerad Thyimar. Hope is the most dangerous of all emotions, for it sustains the soul through the darkest nights, while demanding prices that reason cannot calculate, and hearts can barely endure. In the aftermath of Arcosia's fall, when the great empire's floating cities had crashed to earth and its people scattered like leaves before an autumn storm, one community made a choice that would echo through the centuries: to preserve rather than adapt, to remember rather than forget, to maintain the old ways in defiance of a world that had seemingly moved beyond them forever. High in the Dragonspine Mountains, where the peaks pierced the clouds and the air grew thin enough to challenge even draconic lungs, lay a valley that maps had never recorded and explorers had never found. In a natural fortress created by avalanche and earthquake during the final days of the Empire, the survivors of Thyimar had built something unprecedented in the post-imperial age, a city that looked backward instead of forward, that sought to recreate the glory of the past, rather than forge new accommodations with the present. Gerad Thyimar, the hidden jewel, rose from the mountain mists like a vision from a more noble age. Its crystal spires, though anchored to solid stone rather than floating free, still caught and reflected the light in patterns that painted rainbows across the valley floor. Its architecture followed the classical Arcosian principles of harmonious proportion and draconic symbolism, creating spaces that elevated the spirit while honoring the memory of what had been lost. Most remarkably of all, its population consisted entirely of Dragonborn, who had chosen exile from the wider world rather than compromise with the diminished expectations of their diaspora existence. The founders of Gerad Thyimar had been among Arcosia's most conservative elements, traditionalists who viewed the empire's fall not as the inevitable consequence of prideful overreach, but as a temporary setback that patient effort could overcome. Led by Patriarch Baracus the Unyielding, whose platinum scales bore the ritual scars of ancient ceremonies, long abandoned by more progressive communities, they gathered the most precious remnants of their civilization and retreated to this hidden sanctuary with the declared intention of preserving everything that made Dragonborn culture unique and worthy. In the early years of the city's existence, this preservation effort focused primarily on physical artifacts and written knowledge. The great library of Gerad Thyimar housed scrolls and tomes that were thought lost forever. Military treatises that detailed the tactical innovations of Arcosian generals, philosophical works that explored the ethical implications of draconic power, scientific texts that explained the magical principles underlying their technological achievements. Every piece of imperial regalia, every ceremonial weapon, every architectural element that could be salvaged from the ruins was brought to the hidden city and given place of honor. But the true ambition of Gerad Thyimar extended far beyond mere collection and cataloging. The city's founders intended nothing less than the complete recreation of classical Arcosian society, with all its hierarchies, traditions, and assumptions intact. They established a government based on the old imperial model, with hereditary positions for the great clans and elaborate protocols that governed every aspect of public life. They maintained the ancient educational system, teaching young Dragonborn to read classical Draconic script and speak the formal court language that had once resonated through crystal palaces. Most significantly, they preserved the military traditions that had made Arcosia's armies the terror of the known world. The warriors of Gerad Thyimar, trained with weapons and techniques that other Dragonborn communities had abandoned as impractical for their changed circumstances. They practiced coordinated breath weapon attacks designed for large-scale battlefield deployment, learned formation flying techniques that assumed the availability of aerial mounts, and studied siege warfare methods that required the massive logistical support networks of a great empire. These efforts at preservation created a community that existed in deliberate temporal isolation from the world beyond the mountain barriers. Within the crystal-lit halls of Gerad Thyimar, it was still the golden age of Dragonborn civilization. The citizens spoke as if the Tarathi wars had ended yesterday, rather than generations ago, as if the floating cities might return to the sky at any moment, as if the scattered diaspora were merely temporary guests in foreign lands, who would soon return home to resume their proper places in imperial society. The social structure of the hidden city reflected these assumptions in ways that would have seemed archaic to Dragonborn living among other peoples. The rigid caste system that had characterized late imperial Arcosia was maintained in full, with the platinum caste serving as hereditary rulers, the gold caste providing military leadership and magical expertise, the silver caste managing commerce and craftsmanship, and the copper caste performing the manual labor that kept the city functioning. Intermarriage between castes was forbidden, as was any questioning of the fundamental assumptions that justified this hierarchy. Yet maintaining such an elaborate social system in a community of only a few thousand individuals required compromises that gradually undermined the very purity the founders had sought to preserve. The platinum caste, which in imperial times had numbered in the hundreds, consisted of only 3 bloodlines in Gerad, Thyimar, forcing them to carefully manage marriage alliances to prevent both inbreeding and extinction. The gold caste military leaders found themselves commanding armies that existed more in theory than in practice. Their strategic planning sessions focused on hypothetical campaigns rather than real threats. The economic foundation of the city presented even greater challenges. Imperial Arcosia had supported its elaborate culture through trade with dozens of subject peoples and tribute from hundreds of client communities. Gerad Thyimar had access to none of these resources, forcing its inhabitants to become essentially self-sufficient while maintaining lifestyle expectations shaped by centuries of imperial abundance. The result was a society that lived in deliberate poverty while surrounding itself with symbols of wealth, that practiced austerity while maintaining elaborate ceremonial displays. As decades passed into centuries, the tensions inherent in this system began to manifest in ways that threatened the community's survival. The younger generations, born into isolation and raised on stories of a glorious past they had never experienced, began to question whether the sacrifices required to maintain traditional purity were worth the benefits they provided. They saw their contemporaries in the outside world, adapting to new circumstances with apparent success, developing new forms of Dragonborn culture that honored their heritage, while embracing change and growth. The first major crisis came when Serradeth the Bold, daughter of the reigning Platinum Patriarch, announced her intention to marry Thorak Goldenheart, a member of the Gold Caste whose military achievements had earned him widespread respect throughout the city. By traditional law, such a union was impossible. The bloodline purity that justified Platinum caste rule could not be compromised by marriage outside the hereditary nobility. Yet the practical reality was that Serradeth represented one of only 2 potential heirs to leadership, and her chosen partner was arguably the most capable individual of his generation. The debate that followed divided the city along lines that had never been openly acknowledged. Conservative traditionalists argued that abandoning caste restrictions would invalidate everything Gerad Thyimar stood for, reducing them to just another diaspora community that had compromised its principles for temporary convenience. Progressive voices countered that blind adherence to forms that no longer served their intended purposes was itself a betrayal of the adaptive intelligence that had made Arcosia great in the first place. The resolution, when it finally came, satisfied no one completely while advancing the community's long-term survival. A new category of adaptive tradition was created, allowing for modifications to ancient practices when circumstances absolutely required them, but only after extensive debate and formal approval by representatives of all castes. Serradeth's marriage was permitted under this provision, but she was required to renounce her claim to formal leadership, while retaining her ceremonial position within the Platinum caste hierarchy. This compromise established a pattern that would characterize Gerad Thymar's evolution for generations to come: gradual, reluctant adaptation that preserved the appearance of tradition, while slowly transforming its substance. The city began to develop hybrid institutions that combined classical forms with practical necessities, creating new traditions that honored the old while addressing contemporary realities. The most significant of these innovations was the establishment of the Scroll Keeper tradition, a position that had existed in classical Arcosia, but took on expanded importance in the isolation of Thyimar. The Scroll Keepers were responsible not only for maintaining the city's archives, but for interpreting how ancient wisdom should be applied to modern circumstances. They became the community's primary agents of authorized change, providing scholarly justification for adaptations that might otherwise be viewed as unacceptable departures from traditional purity. Under the guidance of Master Paraxis the Learned, the Scroll Keepers began a comprehensive review of classical texts that revealed surprising flexibility within the traditional framework. Many practices that had been considered immutable were actually documented innovations from earlier periods, precedents that justified further evolution when circumstances warranted. The rigid caste system, for example, had originally been designed to organize a population of millions rather than thousands, and classical sources suggested it had been modified repeatedly throughout imperial history. These discoveries provided intellectual justification for changes that practical necessity was already forcing upon the community. The artificial barriers between castes began to erode as individuals demonstrated excellence in fields traditionally reserved for other bloodlines. Military service, once the exclusive province of the Gold Caste, was open to qualified individuals from all backgrounds, as the community recognized that their survival might depend on every citizen's ability to defend their hidden sanctuary. Yet the most profound transformation in Gerad Thymar's character came through their gradual discovery that total isolation was neither possible nor desirable. Despite their best efforts to remain hidden from the outside world, the city inevitably came into contact with travelers, explorers, and occasionally refugees who had found their way through the mountain passes. These encounters forced the citizens to confront the reality that the world beyond their valley had not remained static during their centuries of isolation. The first extensive contact came when a group of Platinum Cadre paladins, pursuing rumors of a surviving Arcosian settlement, discovered the hidden passages that led to Gerad Thyimar. The ideological confrontation that followed challenged fundamental assumptions on both sides. The Cadre members were shocked to discover Dragonborn, who had learned nothing from their people's historical mistakes, who still spoke of imperial glory and racial superiority, as if the devastating wars with Baal Tarathi had taught no lessons about the dangers of unchecked pride. The citizens of Gerad Thyimar, for their part, were horrified to encounter Dragonborn, who had apparently abandoned everything that made their heritage meaningful. They saw in the Cadre's philosophy of service and humility a complete betrayal of the noble ideals that had motivated their ancestors' great achievements. How could beings who carried the blood of dragons willingly submit themselves to inferior peoples? How could they speak of redemption when they had nothing to atone for except the crime of defending their rightful place in the world's hierarchy? The theological debates that followed were fierce enough to threaten violence, as both sides struggled to understand how fellow Dragonborn could hold views that seemed to contradict everything they believed about their people's nature and destiny. Yet from this conflict emerged insights that neither side could have achieved in isolation. The Cadre members were forced to acknowledge that their philosophy of redemption assumed a level of collective guilt that not all Dragonborn shared, while the citizens of Gerad Thyimar had to confront evidence that their isolation had preserved not only noble traditions, but also dangerous delusions. The compromise that eventually emerged established a limited exchange program that allowed citizens of the hidden city to venture into the outside world, while bringing selected outsiders to experience Gerad Thymar's preserved traditions. These exchanges revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the community's chosen path. Visitors were awed by the city's magnificent architecture and the depth of knowledge preserved in its libraries, but they were also disturbed by the rigid social hierarchies and the citizens' apparent inability to adapt to changed circumstances. Citizens who ventured beyond the mountains returned with reports that challenged many of their fundamental assumptions about the Diaspora communities. They discovered Dragonborn who had not simply abandoned their heritage, but had found new ways to honor it while building successful lives among other peoples. They encountered communities that had preserved essential traditions while discarding elements that no longer served their purposes. Most surprisingly, They found that many Diaspora Dragonborn possessed knowledge and skills that the isolated community lacked, innovations developed through generations of practical experience that theoretical study could not match. These discoveries led to the most significant transformation in Gerad Thymar's history. The gradual recognition that preservation and adaptation were not opposing goals, but complementary aspects of cultural survival. The city's archives contained invaluable knowledge about classical Dragonborn civilization, but that knowledge was incomplete without understanding how it could be applied to contemporary challenges. The diaspora communities had developed practical solutions to modern problems, but they lacked the historical context that could transform expedient adaptations into lasting traditions. The synthesis that emerged from this recognition became known as the New Concordance, a philosophical framework that recognized both the value of preserved tradition and the necessity of evolutionary change. Under this system, Gerad Thyimar began to serve as a cultural repository and research center for the scattered Dragonborn communities, providing historical expertise and traditional knowledge while learning from the practical innovations developed by their far-flung relatives. The hidden city's role as a center of learning and cultural preservation attracted scholars and knowledge seekers from throughout the Dragonborn diaspora, transforming it from an isolated remnant of the past into a vital link between classical tradition and modern innovation. The rigid caste system gradually evolved into a merit-based hierarchy that recognized excellence regardless of bloodline, while the military traditions were adapted to focus on defense and exploration rather than conquest and domination. Perhaps most significantly, the citizens of Gerad Thyimar began to develop a new understanding of their community's purpose and destiny. Rather than viewing themselves as the sole inheritors of true Dragonborn civilization, they came to see their role as guardians of cultural memory, who bore the responsibility of preserving essential knowledge while sharing it with those who could put it to beneficial use. Their isolation was no longer an end in itself, but a means of maintaining perspective and continuity in a rapidly changing world. The prophecies that had sustained the community through its darkest periods of doubt and isolation began to take on new meaning as contact with the outside world revealed unexpected patterns of fulfillment. The ancient texts spoke of a time when the scattered children of dragons would return to their true home, when the floating cities would rise again, when Dragonborn would reclaim their destiny as bridges between mortal and divine realms. These prophecies had long been interpreted as predictions of literal restoration, the rebuilding of Arcosia in its classical form. But the synthesis of knowledge and experience that emerged from Gerad Thymar's transformation suggested alternative interpretations that were both more realistic and more inspiring. The scattered children were indeed returning, not to a physical location but to a shared understanding of their heritage and purpose. The floating cities were rising again, not as aerial fortresses, but as communities of principle that elevated the spirit through service to noble ideals. The destiny of the Dragonborn was being fulfilled, not through domination but through their unique ability to preserve the best elements of different traditions, while building bridges between diverse peoples. As the hidden city opened its crystal gates to welcome visitors and send forth its own children to learn from the wider world, it became clear that Gerad Thymar's greatest treasure was not its magnificent architecture or its precious archives, but its demonstration that seemingly irreconcilable differences could be harmonized through wisdom, patience, and willingness to acknowledge truth wherever it might be found. The preservation of the past and the adaptation to the present were revealed as complementary aspects of the same fundamental drive toward excellence and meaning. In the end, the lost city of Gerad Thyimar found itself precisely by acknowledging that it had never truly been lost at all. It had simply been waiting for the proper moment to emerge from isolation and resume its place in the continuing story of Dragonborn civilization. The crystals that lined its halls caught and reflected not only the light of the mountain sun, but the illumination of understanding that comes when ancient wisdom meets modern need, when pride learns humility, and when preservation serves not the past alone, but the future that grows from seeds planted by previous generations. Chapter 9. Servants of the Dragon Queen. Corruption is not a sudden fall but a gradual descent, beginning with small compromises that seem reasonable, and ending in darkness so complete that its victims no longer remember what light looked like. When Tiamat, the five-headed queen, turned her ancient gaze upon the scattered children of dragonkind, she did not seek to destroy them but to claim them, recognizing in their proud heritage and bitter exile the perfect foundation upon which to build an army of willing servants who would serve evil, not from compulsion but from choice. The Dragon Queen's recruitment of Dragonborn followers began in the immediate aftermath of Arcosia's fall, when rage and despair made even the most noble hearts vulnerable to whispers of vengeance and restoration. She did not appear to them as a force of evil seeking their corruption, but as the true mother of all dragonkind, the ancient power who alone understood their suffering and possessed the strength to grant them justice against those who had wronged them. Her chromatic aspects allowed her to speak to each potential convert in the language they most needed to hear: red for those consumed by rage, blue for those driven by ambition, green for those poisoned by envy, black for those drowning in despair, white for those frozen by hatred. Vaelish Gant was among the first to hear her call, a former palace guard whose family had perished in the siege of Vor-Kragal, and whose faith in Bahamut's protection had died with them. He knelt in the ruins of the Temple of Ascending Flame, his silver scales dulled by ash and grief, his heart empty of everything except the ache of loss. When Tiamat appeared before him in her aspect as the Black Queen, mother of despair and mistress of vengeance, her words seemed to offer the only truth that made sense in a world gone mad. "Your God of justice abandoned you when you needed him most," she whispered, her voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. "Your noble ideals brought only destruction to everything you loved. Your enemies prosper while your people suffer, scattered like beggars across a world that has forgotten their greatness. But I remember, child of dragons, I remember when your ancestors ruled the skies and the lesser races knew their place. I offer you the power to reclaim what was stolen, to make your enemies pay for their crimes, to restore your people to their rightful throne above all creation." The transformation that followed was not the dramatic corruption of legend, but a subtle process of rationalization and gradual compromise. Vaelish did not wake up one morning and decide to embrace evil. He simply began to accept propositions that seemed logical in his current circumstances. If Bahamut truly cared about justice, why did the innocent suffer while the guilty prospered? If mercy was a virtue, why did showing it to enemies only encourage them to commit greater atrocities? If Dragonborn were truly meant to serve others, why had their service brought them nothing but destruction and exile? Each question Tiamat posed carried with it a partial truth that made her larger lies more palatable. The Dragonborn had indeed been betrayed by allies who abandoned them when the war turned difficult. They had shown mercy to enemies who had responded with escalated brutality. They had tried to serve the cause of justice and had seen their civilization reduced to ruins as their reward. These facts, when viewed through the lens of bitterness and despair, seemed to support the conclusion that their noble traditions had been naive mistakes that needed to be abandoned in favor of more practical approaches. Under Tiamat's guidance, Vaelish began to recruit other Dragonborn who shared his sense of grievance and abandonment. He found them among the refugees who had been rejected by potential host communities, among the veterans who could not forget the horrors they had witnessed, among the young who had grown up in exile and resented being forced to beg for acceptance from peoples they had been taught to consider inferior. To each potential convert, he offered the same seductive proposition: acknowledgement of their legitimate grievances combined with promises of power sufficient to address them. The organization that emerged from these recruitment efforts called itself the Crimson Covenant, taking its name from the red aspect of Tiamat that embodied the righteous anger of the wronged. Unlike the Platinum Cadre, which required its members to undergo extensive moral purification and commit themselves to selfless service, the Covenant demanded only that its recruits acknowledge the obvious truth of their situation, that they had been betrayed by false ideals and deserved better than the degraded circumstances in which they found themselves. The philosophy of the Crimson Covenant represented a systematic inversion of traditional Dragonborn values, transforming virtues into vices through clever redefinition and selective interpretation. Pride, which had been identified as the primary cause of Arcosia's downfall, was reframed as proper self-respect that refused to accept undeserved humiliation. Revenge, traditionally condemned as a destructive passion that perpetuated cycles of violence, became justice delayed but not denied. Domination, once viewed as antithetical to the ideal of noble service, was presented as the natural order that placed superior beings in positions of authority over their inferiors. This philosophical framework proved particularly attractive to Dragonborn, who had struggled with the psychological burden of exile and cultural loss. Rather than accepting blame for their ancestors' mistakes or working to earn acceptance from other peoples, Covenant members could maintain their sense of inherent superiority while attributing their current difficulties to external forces beyond their control. They were not refugees seeking charity, but displaced nobility, temporarily prevented from claiming their rightful inheritance. The practical activities of the Covenant reflected these philosophical foundations in ways that gradually escalated from questionable to clearly evil. Initially, they focused on gathering intelligence about the scattered Dragonborn communities and identifying individuals who might be susceptible to recruitment. They established networks of communication that allowed isolated exiles to maintain contact with others who shared their grievances. They provided mutual aid to members who faced discrimination or persecution, creating a sense of community and shared purpose that many had lost in the aftermath of the Diaspora. Yet beneath these seemingly benign activities lay darker currents that became increasingly apparent as the organization matured. The intelligence gathering evolved into espionage that targeted not only potential recruits, but also those Dragonborn who had successfully adapted to life among other peoples. The mutual aid became a system of rewards and punishments that enforced ideological conformity among members. The sense of community was maintained through shared hatred of designated enemies rather than positive bonds of affection and respect. The first overtly criminal activities undertaken by the Covenant were rationalized as necessary responses to unjust persecution. When Dragonborn merchants were cheated by human trading partners, Covenant members would arrange for appropriate retaliation that went far beyond mere recovery of stolen goods. When Dragonborn families were driven from their homes by prejudiced neighbors, the organization would ensure that those responsible suffered consequences severe enough to deter similar actions in the future. When Dragonborn individuals were refused employment or education despite their qualifications, the Covenant would take steps to eliminate the competition that had been unfairly preferred. Each escalation in violent tactics was presented as a reluctant but necessary response to circumstances that left no alternatives. The humans and other peoples had demonstrated through their actions that they understood only force, so force would have to be applied until they learned proper respect for Dragonborn dignity. The traditional methods of peaceful negotiation and gradual integration had proven ineffective, so more direct approaches were required to achieve the same legitimate goals. Asandra Bloodclaw, who joined the Covenant after her family was massacred by human zealots, who blamed all Dragonborn for the ancient war with Baal Tarathi, exemplified the organization's ability to transform personal tragedy into ideological commitment. Her initial motivation was simple vengeance against the specific individuals who had murdered her loved ones, but under Valish's mentorship, her desire for retribution expanded into a broader mission to protect all Dragonborn from similar persecution. The ritual that marked her full acceptance into the Covenant's inner circle required her to formally renounce the false teachings of Bahamut and acknowledge Tiamat as the true mother of all dragonkind. The ceremony took place in a hidden shrine built into a natural cave system, its walls carved with reliefs depicting the 5 chromatic dragons in their aspects as dealers of justice to the unworthy. Cassandra knelt before an altar made from the fused skulls of 5 different types of metallic dragons, symbols of the weakness and naivety that had led to their people's downfall. As she spoke the words of renunciation, Cassandra felt a fundamental change taking place within her spiritual essence. The divine connection that had once linked her to Bahamut's ideals of justice and mercy was severed, replaced by a darker but more immediately satisfying bond to Tiamat's promises of power and revenge. Her breath weapon, once a controlled blast of fire that she had used primarily for crafting and defense, transformed into a corrosive torrent that could eat through steel and stone with equal efficiency. The transformation was not merely magical but psychological, liberating her from moral constraints that had previously limited her actions. She no longer needed to consider whether her enemies deserved the punishments she inflicted upon them. Their opposition to Dragonborn interests was sufficient justification for whatever measures proved necessary to overcome it. She no longer needed to worry about proportionality or collateral damage. The survival of her people justified any sacrifice imposed upon their oppressors. Under the Covenant's influence, Cassandra became one of their most effective field operatives, specializing in infiltration and sabotage missions that weakened communities suspected of harboring anti-Dragonborn sentiment. Her methods were subtle enough to avoid detection, while severe enough to send clear messages about the consequences of crossing Dragonborn interests. A village that refused to trade with Dragonborn merchants might find its grain stores mysteriously contaminated with acid. A city that discriminated against Dragonborn job seekers might discover that its most prominent buildings had developed structural weaknesses that made them unsafe for habitation. These activities brought Cassandra into inevitable conflict with members of the Platinum Cadre, who viewed the Covenant's methods as betrayals of everything their people should represent. The philosophical battle between these two visions of Dragonborn destiny played out through a series of increasingly violent confrontations that divided communities and families along ideological lines. Brother Theon Lightbringer of the Platinum Cadre encountered Cassandra during her assault on the human settlement of Millbrook, where she was attempting to poison the water supply in retaliation for the town council's decision to expel a group of Dragonborn refugees. The fight that followed was as much theological as physical, each combatant representing fundamentally incompatible interpretations of what their shared heritage demanded. Theon argued that their people's suffering came not from external persecution, but from internal corruption, that the pride and arrogance that had led to Arcosia's downfall continued to manifest in those who sought to reclaim dominance through violence, rather than earn respect through service. Cassandra countered that such thinking was the poison that kept Dragonborn subjugated, that accepting blame for defending themselves against aggression was the height of self-destructive foolishness. The battle's outcome was inconclusive in practical terms. Both combatants were severely wounded and forced to withdraw before achieving their objectives, but its symbolic significance reverberated throughout the scattered Dragonborn communities. It demonstrated that the philosophical differences between the Covenant and the Cadre could not be resolved through debate or compromise, that the fundamental question of what Dragonborn heritage meant would ultimately be decided through conflict between those who embraced opposing interpretations. This conflict intensified as both organizations grew in size and influence, developing parallel structures that competed for the loyalty of individual Dragonborn and entire communities. Where the Cadre established temples dedicated to Bahamut's worship and the cultivation of virtue, the Covenant built shrines to Tiamat that celebrated strength and the righteous application of power. Where Cadre members took vows of poverty and selfless service, Covenant initiates swore oaths of mutual support and justified retaliation against their enemies. The recruitment methods employed by each organization reflected their fundamental philosophical differences. The Cadre sought individuals who had demonstrated moral excellence and a willingness to sacrifice personal interests for the greater good. The Covenant targeted those who had suffered injustices and possessed the strength to seek redress through direct action. Both could point to legitimate grievances and genuine achievements to support their claims about which path better served Dragonborn interests. Yet, as the Covenant's activities grew more extreme, many Dragonborn who had initially sympathized with their goals began to question whether their methods were compatible with any reasonable definition of justice or honor. The organization's increasing reliance on terror tactics and indiscriminate violence alienated potential supporters who agreed with their grievances, but could not stomach their solutions. The turning point came when Covenant operatives, acting without official authorization, but clearly influenced by the organization's rhetoric, orchestrated the massacre of an entire human village, whose only crime had been requesting that a local Dragonborn community relocate to reduce tensions with nervous neighbors. The attack, led by a corrupted Dragonborn sorcerer, who had been driven mad by exposure to chromatic dragon influence, left no survivors and created a backlash against all Dragonborn that threatened to undo decades of patient integration work. Valish Gant's response to this atrocity revealed the full extent of his moral corruption. Rather than condemning the massacre or expelling those responsible, he declared it a regrettable but necessary demonstration of what happened when people refused to show proper respect for Dragonborn dignity. The victims had brought their fate upon themselves through their unreasonable demands, and their deaths would serve as a warning to others who might consider similar provocations. This justification of mass murder as defensive action finally galvanized the opposition to the Covenant among both Dragonborn and other peoples. Communities that had previously remained neutral in the conflict between the Cadre and the Covenant now actively supported efforts to root out and eliminate Tiamat's servants. The massacre had demonstrated that the Covenant's philosophy inevitably led to atrocities that no civilized society could tolerate. The war that followed was fought not only in physical battlefields, but in the hearts and minds of individual Dragonborn who had to choose between competing visions of their people's future. Families were divided as siblings chose different sides, communities were torn apart as neighbors embraced opposing ideologies, and the unity that had once characterized Dragonborn culture seemed to dissolve into irreconcilable fragments. Yet from this conflict emerged a clearer understanding of what was truly at stake in the struggle between Platinum and Crimson. The Covenant's vision of restored Dragonborn dominance offered the seductive promise of escaping the difficult work of earning respect through virtue, but it could only be achieved through methods that transformed the supposedly superior race into something genuinely inferior to those they sought to rule. The Cadre's path of redemptive service was harder and offered no guarantees of success, but it preserved the essential dignity that made Dragonborn heritage worth defending. As the civil war raged through the scattered communities of the Diaspora, it became clear that both sides were fighting not merely for political control, but for the soul of their people. The outcome would determine whether future generations of Dragonborn would inherit a legacy of nobility earned through sacrifice and service, or a heritage of power claimed through domination and terror. The servants of the Dragon Queen had offered their people a path back to greatness that required no moral growth, no painful self-examination, no acknowledgement of past mistakes or commitment to future improvement. It was a seductive vision that appealed to every wounded pride and justified grievance, but its ultimate destination was a darkness that would consume not only their enemies but themselves as well. In choosing to serve Tiamat rather than Bahamut, to embrace corruption rather than redemption, to pursue dominance rather than honor, the Crimson Covenant had demonstrated that the greatest threat to Dragonborn survival came not from external persecution, but from internal decay. The gradual abandonment of the values that had once made their civilization worthy of the Draconic heritage it claimed to represent. Chapter 10. Modern Dragonborn Societies. Adaptation is the truest test of strength, revealing whether a people can preserve their essential character while embracing the changes necessary for survival in an ever-evolving world. In the centuries following the fall of Arcosia and the bitter civil war between Platinum and Crimson philosophies, the scattered Dragonborn communities faced the ultimate challenge, not merely to endure as refugees and exiles, but to thrive as integral members of the diverse civilizations that had emerged from the ashes of the ancient empires. The modern world, into which the Dragonborn integrated, bore little resemblance to the one their ancestors had known. The great age of empires built around single dominant races had given way to cosmopolitan societies, where humans, elves, dwarves, halflings, and dozens of other peoples lived and worked together in complex webs of mutual dependence. Trade routes spanned continents, carrying not only goods, but ideas that challenged traditional assumptions about how different cultures should relate to one another. Magic had become democratized, its secrets shared freely rather than hoarded by elite castes, while technological innovations had created new possibilities for cooperation and prosperity. Into this dynamic environment, the Dragonborn brought their unique combination of physical capabilities, cultural traditions, and hard-won wisdom about the dangers of unchecked ambition. Their breath weapons made them valuable in industries that required controlled application of elemental forces: metalworking, glassmaking, food preservation, and construction. Their natural longevity and excellent memories made them ideal archivists, historians, and keepers of institutional knowledge. Their military traditions, tempered by painful lessons about the costs of warfare, produced exceptional guards, peacekeepers, and strategic advisors. Yet integration was never simply a matter of finding economic niches where Dragonborn abilities were valued. It required fundamental changes in how they understood themselves and their place in the world. Adaptations that challenged core assumptions about hierarchy, destiny, and the proper relationship between superior and inferior beings. The Dragonborn had to learn to see other peoples not as subjects to be ruled or competitors to be defeated, but as equals worthy of respect and potential partners in shared endeavors. The merchant clans exemplified this transformation most clearly, developing trading networks that leveraged Dragonborn advantages while serving the broader economic needs of their adopted communities. The House of Embered Gold, established by descendants of the old Arcosian nobility, who had fled the Empire's collapse with little more than their skills and determination, built their success on a foundation of absolute reliability and innovative problem-solving. When human merchants complained that transporting delicate glassware across dangerous mountain passes resulted in unacceptable losses, the Dragonborn traders developed new packing techniques that used their fire breath to create custom foam cushioning for each piece. When elven artisans needed rare minerals that could only be found in locations too hazardous for ordinary prospectors, Dragonborn expeditions used their natural resilience and breath weapons to establish mining operations in volcanic regions and frozen wastes that others could not access. Most importantly, the merchant clans learned to build relationships based on mutual benefit rather than assumed superiority. They honored their contracts scrupulously, delivered goods as promised regardless of circumstances, and stood behind their products with guarantees that reflected genuine confidence in their quality. When competitors attempted to undercut their prices through inferior merchandise or exploitative labor practices, the Dragonborn response was not retaliation, but demonstration, proving through consistent excellence that customers would pay premium prices for premium service. Master Thessarian Brightflame of the Embered Gold exemplified this new approach to Dragonborn commerce during the crisis of the Burning Harbor, when a rival trading company attempted to destroy his family's reputation by spreading rumors that their fire-preserved foods contained dangerous magical residues. Rather than responding with the threats and intimidation that their ancestors might have employed, Thessarian invited representatives from every major trading house to witness public demonstrations of his preservation techniques. The testing proved not only that the rumors were false, but that the Dragonborn methods actually produced food that was safer and more nutritious than conventional alternatives. More significantly, Thessarian's willingness to subject his family's proprietary techniques to public scrutiny demonstrated a level of confidence and transparency that impressed even his competitors. Several rival houses subsequently approached him about licensing his innovations, leading to partnerships that benefited the entire regional economy. The military units that incorporated Dragonborn personnel faced different challenges, but achieved equally remarkable adaptations. Traditional Dragonborn combat doctrine had emphasized individual prowess and the coordination of breath weapons in large-scale formations designed for open battlefield warfare. Modern military needs required integration with diverse unit types, adaptation to urban environments, and emphasis on peacekeeping rather than conquest. The Iron Scale Regiment, a mixed-race military unit serving the Confederation of Free Cities, developed new tactical doctrines that maximized the advantages of Dragonborn capabilities while minimizing their limitations. Dragonborn soldiers were trained to serve as specialized support rather than frontline fighters, using their breath weapons to create battlefield effects that enhanced the effectiveness of their human, elven, and dwarven comrades. In siege situations, Dragonborn fire breathers could superheat enemy fortifications to the point where defending them became impossible, while cold breathers could freeze moats and water barriers to allow friendly forces to advance. During urban pacification missions, lightning breathers could disable magical defenses without causing the structural damage that conventional siege weapons would inflict. Acid breathers proved invaluable for rapid demolition work that cleared obstacles and created new routes of advance. Yet the regiment's greatest innovation was its emphasis on non-lethal applications of Dragonborn abilities. Soldiers were trained to use their breath weapons for crowd control, creating barriers of flame or ice that channeled civilian movement without causing injury. They learned to modulate their exhalations to produce stunning effects that incapacitated opponents without killing them, allowing for capture and interrogation rather than wholesale slaughter. Captain Seradeth Stormwing, the first Dragonborn to achieve flag rank in the Confederation's military hierarchy, revolutionized peacekeeping operations through her development of the Gentle Storm Doctrine. Her approach emphasized that true military superiority lay not in the ability to destroy enemies, but in the capacity to resolve conflicts without violence, using overwhelming force as a deterrent rather than a weapon. During the Merchants' Quarter riots, when ethnic tensions between human and halfling communities threatened to tear apart the city of Golden Haven, Seradeth's forces used coordinated breath weapon displays to create spectacular but harmless light shows that captured the attention of angry crowds while her negotiators worked to address the underlying grievances. The visual demonstration of power, combined with obvious restraint in its application, convinced both sides that continued violence would be futile, while peaceful resolution remained possible. The academic institutions where Dragonborn scholars found their calling represented perhaps the most successful integration of their people into modern society. Their natural longevity made them ideal for long-term research projects that required decades of sustained effort, while their cultural memory preserved knowledge that might otherwise be lost to the rapid pace of contemporary change. The University of Platinum Spires, founded jointly by human and Dragonborn educators in the cosmopolitan city of Whitehaven, became the premier center for historical research and cross-cultural studies in the known world. Its archives contained not only traditional texts, but oral histories passed down through Dragonborn families, personal accounts of the Tarathi Wars recorded by actual participants, and philosophical treatises that explored the lessons learned from their people's rise and fall. Professor Barakas, the thoughtful, whose bronze scales bore the ritual markings of a traditional keeper, but whose mind embraced the methodological innovations of modern scholarship, exemplified the synthesis of old wisdom and new knowledge that characterized Dragonborn academic achievement. His masterwork, The Cycles of Empire, Lessons from Arcosia for Contemporary Statecraft, became required reading in diplomatic schools throughout the civilized world. The book's central thesis challenged conventional assumptions about the inevitability of imperial decline, arguing that civilizations fell not because of external pressures, but because of internal contradictions that could be identified and addressed through careful analysis. Using the Arcosian experience as a case study, Barakas demonstrated how pride, isolation, and assumption of superiority created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit, while humility, adaptation, and respect for others provided foundations for sustainable prosperity. Yet the professor's greatest contribution was not his theoretical framework, but his practical application of scholarly methods to contemporary problems. When the alliance of coastal cities faced a succession crisis that threatened to dissolve their confederation, Barakas was called upon to provide historical analysis of similar situations and their outcomes. His research revealed patterns of successful transition that could be adapted to current circumstances, providing the political framework that preserved unity while addressing legitimate concerns about representation and autonomy. the artistic communities where Dragonborn found expression for their cultural heritage while contributing to the broader aesthetic traditions of their adopted societies, produced some of the most remarkable examples of successful integration. Dragonborn artists brought with them techniques and perspectives shaped by their unique physical capabilities and cultural memories, creating new forms of expression that enriched the artistic landscape while preserving essential elements of their own traditions. The Crystal Garden Collective, established in the artistic quarter of the great trade city of Silvermere, became renowned for its innovative fusion of traditional Dragonborn crystal shaping techniques with contemporary sculptural aesthetics. The collective's masterpiece, the Memorial of Shared Sorrows, commemorated all the peoples who had suffered during the ancient wars between Arcosia and Vale Tarath, creating a space for contemplation and healing that served the entire community. The memorial's central element was a crystal formation that had been shaped using Dragonborn breath weapons to create internal structures that refracted light in patterns, representing the stories of loss and redemption from multiple cultural traditions. Human visitors could see representations of their ancestors' struggles against imperial oppression, while Dragonborn could recognize the artistic motifs that honored their people's fallen heroes. The shared space created opportunities for understanding and empathy that transcended the historical resentments that had previously divided these communities. Master Paraxis Brightforge, whose fire breath could achieve temperatures and control levels that no conventional tool could match, developed new techniques for working with materials that had previously been considered impossible to shape. His collaboration with elven artisans produced jewelry that incorporated living wood with precious metals, creating pieces that continued to grow and change over time. His partnership with dwarven smiths resulted in weapons and armor that combined the best qualities of multiple forging traditions, producing items that were both beautiful and functional. Yet perhaps the most significant aspect of these artistic collaborations was their demonstration that Dragonborn capabilities were most effective when combined with other people's skills rather than used in isolation. The crystal formations required not only Dragonborn breath weapons, but human engineering knowledge to create stable support structures. The metal and wood jewelry needed elven understanding of natural growth patterns, as well as Dragonborn precision in temperature control. The enhanced weapons and armor demanded dwarven metallurgical expertise alongside Dragonborn elemental mastery. The religious communities that emerged around reformed Dragonborn spiritual traditions represented another crucial aspect of their integration into modern society. The ancient worship practices that had centered on Draconic superiority and imperial destiny required fundamental reinterpretation to serve communities that valued diversity and mutual respect over hierarchy and dominance. The Temple of Balanced Scales, established by progressive Dragonborn theologians working in partnership with scholars from multiple faith traditions, developed new interpretations of Draconic mythology that emphasized the complementary nature of different people's spiritual gifts. Rather than viewing dragons as inherently superior to other divine beings, the Reformed theology presented them as representatives of specific aspects of universal truth that achieved their full meaning only in relationship with other divine manifestations. High Priestess Cassandra Truthseeker, whose own journey from bitter exile to spiritual leadership embodied the transformation her people had undergone, preached that the true lesson of the Arcosian fall was not that Dragonborn had been betrayed by false ideals, but that they had misunderstood the nature of the ideals themselves. Justice could not be achieved through domination, wisdom could not be preserved through isolation, and strength could not be maintained through the oppression of others. The temple's services incorporated elements from multiple religious traditions, creating worship experiences that honored the diverse backgrounds of its congregants, while maintaining the essential Dragonborn emphasis on personal transformation and ethical growth. The breath weapon blessings that had once been used to demonstrate Draconic power were adapted to serve healing and purification functions that benefited all participants regardless of their racial heritage. During the plague of withering shadows that threatened to devastate the region around Silvermere, The temple's mixed congregation worked together to develop treatments that combined Dragonborn cleansing breath with elven herbal knowledge and human medical techniques. The coordinated response not only contained the epidemic, but demonstrated the practical benefits of cooperative spiritual practice. Yet the integration of Dragonborn into modern society was not without its challenges and setbacks. Centuries of cultural conditioning could not be overcome overnight, and many Dragonborn struggled with feelings of displacement and loss of identity as they adapted to radically different social expectations. The younger generations, born into cosmopolitan societies and educated in integrated schools, sometimes found themselves caught between their ancestral heritage and their contemporary reality. The generational tensions that emerged within Dragonborn families reflected broader questions about cultural preservation and adaptation that all immigrant communities faced. Traditional parents worried that their children were losing touch with essential aspects of their heritage, while the younger generation often viewed ancestral customs as outdated obstacles to full participation in modern society. These tensions came to a head during the Festival of Scales controversy in Whitehaven, when young Dragonborn activists proposed replacing the traditional celebration of Draconic ancestry with a new festival that honored their people's contributions to the diverse society they now inhabited. Conservative community leaders viewed this proposal as a betrayal of everything their ancestors had died to preserve, while progressive voices argued that rigid adherence to obsolete traditions was itself a betrayal of the adaptive intelligence that had allowed their people to survive. The resolution that emerged from months of heated debate reflected the mature wisdom that Dragonborn communities had developed through generations of negotiating between tradition and innovation. The Festival of Scales was retained but expanded to include recognition of other people's contributions to Dragonborn's success, while the new Festival of Shared Skies was established to celebrate the multicultural society that had emerged from the cooperation of diverse peoples. The economic opportunities available to Dragonborn in modern society extended far beyond their traditional roles as warriors and craftsmen. Their unique combination of physical capabilities, cultural memory, and adaptive intelligence made them valuable in fields that had not existed during the Imperial period. Dragonborn archaeologists used their breath weapons to carefully excavate delicate artifacts, while their longevity allowed them to pursue research projects that spanned multiple human generations. The Skywatch Observatory, the premier astronomical research institution of the age, employed Dragonborn scholars whose natural ability to function at high altitudes made them ideal for conducting observations from mountaintop installations that would challenge other researchers. Their cultural traditions of precise observation and detailed record-keeping, combined with their emotional investment in understanding cosmic patterns that might predict future events, produced breakthrough discoveries about planetary movements and stellar phenomena. Master Serafina Stargazer's identification of the recurring comet that had been visible during major historical events led to new theories about the relationship between celestial mechanics and earthly affairs. Her ability to work through the harsh conditions at extreme altitude, combined with decades of patient observation, revealed patterns that ground-based astronomy had missed. More importantly, her collaborative approach to research, which incorporated the mathematical insights of human scholars and the instrumental innovations of gnomish inventors, demonstrated that the most significant scientific advances came from combining different peoples' strengths. The diplomatic corps of the major nations increasingly relied upon Dragonborn ambassadors, whose unique perspective on the rise and fall of empires made them valuable advisors on questions of international relations and conflict prevention. Their personal and cultural memory of catastrophic warfare provided credibility when they argued for peaceful resolution of disputes, while their natural longevity allowed them to build relationships that transcended the shorter political cycles that governed other people's decision-making. Ambassador Thorak Peaceweaver's mediation of the Borderstone dispute between the Kingdom of Valeria and the Merchant Republic of Goldshore prevented what analysts believed could have escalated into a regional war. His approach combined traditional diplomatic methods with innovations drawn from Dragonborn conflict resolution traditions, creating a framework for negotiation that addressed not only the immediate territorial disagreements, but the underlying cultural misunderstandings that had made compromise seem impossible. The success of his mediation efforts led to his appointment as the first permanent Secretary General of the Council of Nations, a position that required managing the competing interests of dozens of sovereign states, while maintaining the delicate balance of power that preserved regional stability. His Dragonborn heritage provided both advantages and challenges in this role, while his longevity and cultural memory made him uniquely qualified to understand historical patterns and long-term consequences. His people's reputation for pride and inflexibility created suspicions that had to be overcome through consistent demonstration of fairness and restraint. The technological innovations that emerged from Dragonborn participation in modern research and development efforts revolutionized industries that had remained essentially unchanged for centuries. Their breath weapons provided new methods for materials processing that could not be replicated through conventional means, while their cultural emphasis on precision and excellence established quality standards that elevated entire sectors of the economy. The Bright Forge Consortium, a partnership between Dragonborn artisans and gnomish inventors, developed new techniques for creating magical items that combined the reliability of mechanical engineering with the flexibility of enchanted materials. Their products were renowned not only for their effectiveness but for their durability and safety, addressing concerns about magical devices that had previously limited their adoption in civilian applications. Master inventor Kazakh Flameright's development of the controlled burn furnace revolutionized metalworking by allowing precise temperature control that could be maintained for extended periods without the fuel consumption and pollution associated with conventional methods. The furnace design incorporated chambers where Dragonborn operators could apply their breath weapons in coordinated patterns that created complex heating profiles impossible to achieve through other means. The innovation's impact extended far beyond improved manufacturing efficiency. The reduced environmental impact of the new furnaces made large-scale industrial operations feasible in areas where pollution concerns had previously prevented development. The precision temperature control enabled the creation of new alloys with properties that had only been theoretical possibilities. Most importantly, the technology required ongoing cooperation between Dragonborn operators and engineers from other races, creating employment opportunities that leveraged unique Dragonborn abilities while fostering integration into the broader industrial economy. As the Dragonborn communities continued to evolve within their adopted societies, they faced the ongoing challenge of maintaining their distinctive identity while participating fully in the multicultural civilization that had become their home. The solutions they developed represented a new model for how immigrant peoples could preserve their heritage while contributing to the common good, demonstrating that adaptation and preservation were not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of cultural survival. The modern Dragonborn had learned from their ancestors' mistakes without abandoning their ancestors' wisdom, embracing change without losing themselves in the process. They had discovered that true strength lay not in dominating others, but in earning their respect, that genuine nobility came not from inherited privilege, but from chosen service, and that the greatest honor was found not in ruling over diverse peoples, but in standing beside them as equals in the grand work of building a better world for all who shared it. Chapter 11. The Dragon Marked. Destiny manifests in the flesh of those chosen to bear its weight, marking them with signs that cannot be hidden or denied, transforming them into living prophecies whose very existence reshapes the world around them. Among the scattered children of dragonkind, rare individuals are born bearing marks that transcend the normal expressions of draconic heritage, scales that shimmer with otherworldly light, eyes that hold depths of ancient wisdom, voices that carry harmonics of true dragon speech, and presences that command attention from the moment of their first breath. These dragon-marked, as they have come to be known throughout the Diaspora communities, represent something unprecedented in the long history of their people. Where ordinary Dragonborn carry diluted traces of their draconic ancestry, the marked bear concentrated essences that seem to pulse with the same primordial power that once flowed through the veins of the great worms themselves. Their appearance among the scattered clans is never random, never merely genetic chance, but always coincides with moments of crisis or transformation that require intervention from forces beyond normal mortal capability. The first of the modern dragon-marked was Piraxis Stormborn, whose birth in the hidden mountain settlement of Copper Falls was accompanied by phenomena that left no doubt about his unique nature. On the night of his delivery, lightning struck the same spot 7 times without causing fire or damage, while the aurora borealis appeared in skies too far south for such manifestations. When the midwife first held the newborn infant, his scales blazed with inner light that illuminated the entire birthing chamber, and his first cry resonated with harmonic frequencies that shattered crystal goblets throughout the village. But it was not merely the circumstances of his birth that marked Piraxis as extraordinary. It was the physical characteristics that became apparent as he grew. His scales were not the uniform bronze typical of his bloodline, but a complex pattern of metallic hues that shifted and changed with his emotional state, cycling through gold, silver, copper, and platinum, in patterns that seemed to tell stories of their own. His eyes held depths that appeared far older than his chronological age, and those who looked into them reported seeing brief glimpses of ancient memories that could not possibly belong to a child. Most remarkably, Piraxis possessed abilities that extended far beyond normal Dragonborn capabilities. His breath weapon could manifest as any of the elemental types depending upon need and circumstance, shifting from fire to frost to lightning with fluid grace that defied conventional understanding of Draconic heritage. He could understand and speak any language, after hearing only a few words, as if the fundamental structures of communication were hardwired into his consciousness. Most unsettling of all, he seemed to possess fragments of prophetic insight, making casual references to future events that would not occur for years or decades. The appearance of such a being among their people sparked intense debate within Dragonborn communities about the meaning and implications of his existence. Conservative traditionalists interpreted his marks as signs of divine favor, evidence that their people had not been abandoned by their Draconic ancestors, but remained under their protection and guidance. Progressive voices worried that focusing too much attention on a single individual, no matter how remarkable, risked recreating the hierarchical thinking that had contributed to their empire's downfall. Religious scholars from multiple traditions found themselves drawn to study Piraxis and the growing number of other dragon-marked individuals who began appearing throughout the scattered communities. Brother Thessarian of the Platinum Cadre spent months observing the boy, documenting his abilities, and trying to understand their theological significance. His conclusion, published in the influential treatise Signs and Portents, Divine Will and Mortal Flesh, argued that the dragon-marked represented a new phase in the relationship between dragonkind and their mortal children. According to Thessarian's interpretation, the ancient dragons who had first created the Dragonborn had not simply given them physical gifts and then abandoned them to their fate. Instead, they had implanted within the bloodlines the potential for periodic reawakening, genetic triggers that would activate when their descendants faced challenges that required intervention from higher powers. The dragon-marked were not freaks or anomalies, but the intended mechanism by which draconic wisdom would guide their people through crises that normal abilities could not address. This theory gained credibility as more dragon-marked individuals appeared, and their unique characteristics became better understood. Each seemed to manifest abilities and insights that addressed specific needs within their communities. Seraphina Truth Seer, born to a family of Diaspora refugees struggling to preserve their cultural traditions, possessed an uncanny ability to distinguish between authentic ancient practices and later innovations that had been mistakenly incorporated into their heritage. Her gift allowed her community to purify their traditions while adapting them more effectively to contemporary circumstances. Thorak Mindbridge, whose appearance coincided with violent conflicts between different Dragonborn philosophical factions, demonstrated unprecedented ability to understand and communicate between groups whose worldviews had become irreconcilably opposed. His presence at negotiations between Platinum Cadre representatives and moderate Crimson Covenant members facilitated the first successful peace talks in decades, leading to agreements that neither side had thought possible. Cassandra Voidwalker, perhaps the most mysterious of the Dragon Marked, possessed abilities that seemed to transcend the normal boundaries of space and time. She could appear simultaneously in multiple locations, communicate across vast distances without magical aid, and access memories and knowledge that belonged to Dragonborn who had died centuries before her birth. Her gifts proved invaluable during the crisis of the Scattered Stones, when several Dragonborn communities faced coordinated attacks from unknown enemies and needed rapid coordination of their defensive efforts. Yet, the Dragon Marked were not simply living tools created to solve their people's problems. They were complex individuals whose extraordinary gifts came with equally extraordinary burdens. The constant awareness of their unique nature isolated them from normal social relationships, while the expectations placed upon them by their communities created pressures that few mortals could withstand. Many struggled with questions of identity and purpose, wondering whether their thoughts and choices were truly their own, or merely expressions of ancient programming embedded in their enhanced genetics. Pyrax's Stormborn's adolescence exemplified these struggles, as he grappled with abilities that seemed to operate according to their own logic, rather than his conscious will. His prophetic insights came without warning, and often concerned events he felt powerless to influence, creating a sense of tragic inevitability about future disasters he could foresee but not prevent. His linguistic abilities made him a natural diplomat and cultural bridge, but also left him feeling rootless, as if he belonged fully to no single community or tradition. The social dynamics that developed around the Dragon Marked reflected both the best and worst aspects of Dragonborn nature. Many communities elevated them to positions of leadership and authority, for which their chronological age and practical experience had not prepared them, expecting wisdom and judgment that even enhanced genetics could not automatically provide. Others viewed them with suspicion or fear, worried that their abilities represented a form of draconic manipulation that might ultimately serve purposes antithetical to mortal welfare. The Conclave of Scales convened in the neutral territory of Whitehaven to address questions about the Dragon Marked and their role in contemporary Dragonborn society, brought together representatives from across the Diaspora to debate these issues. The discussions revealed fundamental disagreements about whether the marked individuals should be encouraged to develop their abilities to their fullest potential, or taught to suppress them in favor of more normal existence. Elder Barakas the Contemplative argued that the Dragon Marked represented the next stage in Dragonborn evolution, beings who would eventually bridge the gap between mortal limitation and draconic transcendence. In his view, they should be nurtured and trained to become the leaders and guides their people needed to reclaim their rightful place in the world's hierarchy. Their abilities were gifts that should be cultivated rather than constrained, tools that could restore Dragonborn civilization to heights that surpassed even their imperial glory. Matriarch Seredith, the Humble, countered that such thinking replicated the prideful assumptions that had led to Arcosia's downfall, creating new hierarchies based on perceived genetic superiority rather than demonstrated virtue. The Dragon Marked might possess remarkable abilities, but these gifts did not automatically confer moral authority or practical wisdom. More dangerous still was the temptation to view them as chosen instruments of destiny, rather than individuals who deserved the freedom to define their own purposes and paths. The compromise position that emerged from months of debate established guidelines that attempted to balance recognition of the Dragon Marked's unique nature with respect for their autonomy and the legitimate concerns of the broader community. They would be offered specialized education and training to help them understand and control their abilities, but would not be automatically granted authority or leadership positions based solely on their genetic gifts. Their insights and counsel would be valued, but not accepted uncritically, and they would be expected to earn respect through their actions rather than demanding it based on their nature. Perhaps more importantly, the Conclave established the principle that the Dragon Marked belonged not to any single community or faction, but to all Dragonborn, and by extension to the broader world that had become their home. Their gifts were too valuable and too dangerous to be monopolized by particular groups, while their welfare was too important to be entrusted to any single authority. A network of mentors and guardians was established to ensure that each dragon-marked individual received appropriate support while maintaining connections to the diverse traditions and perspectives that characterized modern Dragonborn society. The practical implementation of these principles proved more challenging than their theoretical formulation. The dragon-marked themselves often chafed against the restrictions and oversight that came with their special status, particularly as they reached adulthood and sought to establish independent lives and identities. Many felt trapped between their community's expectations and their own desires, neither fully trusted to make autonomous decisions, nor completely free to pursue their individual goals. Seraphina Truthseer's rebellion against her designated role as cultural authenticator exemplified these tensions. Assigned by her community's elders to validate traditional practices and settle disputes about proper ceremonial procedures, she gradually became uncomfortable with the authority her gift granted her over matters that she felt should be decided through democratic deliberation, rather than genetic lottery. Her announcement that she would no longer serve as an arbiter of authenticity sparked a crisis that threatened to fragment her community along generational and ideological lines. The resolution came through Seraphina's own innovative interpretation of her abilities and responsibilities. Rather than completely rejecting her role, or accepting it uncritically, she redefined her function from that of ultimate authority to collaborative researcher. She would continue to use her gifts to distinguish between ancient and recent traditions, but would present her findings as information to be considered rather than verdicts to be accepted. The community would make collective decisions about which traditions to preserve, modify, or abandon, based on her research combined with their own values and circumstances. This model of the dragon marked, as enhanced advisors rather than destined rulers, proved influential in other communities grappling with similar questions. It allowed the marked individuals to contribute their unique perspectives and abilities, while maintaining the democratic and egalitarian principles that had emerged from the lessons of imperial collapse. Their gifts were treated as valuable resources to be shared, rather than sources of inherent authority to be obeyed. The prophetic aspects of dragon-marked abilities created particular challenges for both the individuals who possessed them and the communities that had to decide how to respond to their warnings and insights. The visions and foresight that many marked individuals experienced were often fragmentary and symbolic rather than clear predictions, requiring interpretation that could lead to very different conclusions about appropriate responses. Thorak Mindbridge's visions of a great convergence, interpreted by some as predicting the reunification of the scattered Dragonborn communities, and by others as warning of an impending catastrophe that would threaten all peoples, exemplified these interpretive challenges. His descriptions of floating cities returned to the sky could represent either literal restoration of Arcosian technology or metaphorical elevation of Dragonborn culture to new heights of achievement and influence. The debates over how to respond to such prophecies revealed continuing tensions within Dragonborn society about their ultimate destiny and purpose. Those who maintained nostalgic attachment to their imperial past interpreted the visions as confirmation that their exile was temporary, that their people would eventually reclaim their position as the rightful rulers of a restored Draconic empire. Others saw the prophecies as warnings against repeating historical mistakes, reminders that any attempt to recreate the past would lead to the same catastrophic outcomes that had destroyed their ancestors' achievements. The dragon-marked themselves often struggled with the burden of being treated as oracles and harbingers rather than simply as individuals with unusual abilities. The constant pressure to interpret their experiences and provide guidance about future events created psychological stress that few were equipped to handle. Many reported feeling like prisoners of their own gifts, unable to experience normal relationships or pursue personal interests, without being viewed through the lens of their prophetic significance. The support networks established by the Conclave of Scales attempted to address these issues by providing the marked individuals with training in meditation and mental discipline techniques that help them distinguish between their own thoughts and emotions and the external influences that shape their enhanced perceptions. They were taught methods for controlling and channeling their abilities rather than being overwhelmed by them, and given access to counselors who could help them process the unique challenges their nature created. Yet perhaps the most valuable support came from connections with others who shared similar experiences. The Dragon-marked began to form their own informal community, communicating across vast distances through methods that conventional understanding could not explain, and offering each other the acceptance and understanding that even their most sympathetic guardians could not fully provide. They developed their own traditions and practices for managing their abilities while maintaining their connections to their individual communities and the broader Dragonborn diaspora. As the number of dragon-marked individuals continued to increase and their abilities became better understood, patterns began to emerge that suggested their appearance was indeed connected to larger forces shaping the destiny of their people and the world itself. The geographical distribution of their births seemed to follow lines of power and significance that maps could not capture, while the timing of their emergence correlated with events and crises that required exactly the types of intervention their unique gifts could provide. The implications of these patterns remained subjects of intense speculation and debate among scholars, theologians, and the marked individuals themselves. Were they witnessing the beginning of a new age in which the boundaries between mortal and divine would blur, allowing for unprecedented cooperation between draconic powers and their mortal children? Or were the increasing manifestations of draconic essence signs of approaching crisis that would test the survival skills their people had developed through centuries of exile and adaptation? The Dragon-marked represented both the culmination of their people's journey from imperial pride to diaspora humility, and the beginning of something entirely new, a synthesis of ancient wisdom and modern understanding that might finally fulfill the original promise of the Dragonborn creation. They carried within their enhanced genetics not only the concentrated essence of their draconic ancestors, but also the accumulated lessons of their people's historical experiences, making them uniquely qualified to guide the next phase of Dragonborn evolution. Yet their true significance lay not in their individual abilities, or even their collective potential, but in their demonstration that the bond between dragons and mortals remained vital and active. The marks they bore were not merely genetic anomalies, but signs of continuing investment in mortal welfare by powers that transcended individual existence. Their presence proved that the Dragonborn had not been abandoned to face an uncertain future alone, but remained connected to sources of wisdom and strength that could guide them through whatever challenges lay ahead. In the shimmering scales and ancient eyes of the Dragon-marked, we see reflected both the glory of what Dragonborn had once been, and the promise of what they might yet become, not through conquest and domination, but through service and synthesis, building bridges between different peoples and traditions, while maintaining their unique identity as children of dragons walking among mortals, in an age when both needed the wisdom that only such synthesis could provide. Chapter 12. Legacy of Scale and Flame. Identity is not inherited but forged, shaped by choices made in moments of trial, when the easy path diverges from the right one, when the weight of ancestry must be balanced against the demands of conscience, and when the question of what we truly are can only be answered by examining what we choose to become. For the Dragonborn, this eternal struggle between heritage and destiny has defined every generation since the first mortal throat exhaled draconic flame, creating a people whose very existence bridges the gap between the divine and the mundane, the eternal and the temporal, the power to destroy and the wisdom to create. To carry dragon blood in mortal veins is to live with constant awareness of contradictions that cannot be resolved through simple choices or clear principles. The fire that warms a home can consume a city. The strength that protects the innocent can oppress the vulnerable. The pride that maintains dignity can blind one to necessary truths. Every Dragonborn must learn to navigate these dualities, finding balance between opposing forces that lesser beings rarely experience with such intensity or immediacy. The physical manifestations of draconic heritage serve as daily reminders of this complex identity. Scales that catch and reflect light speak of beauty and resilience, but also of the barriers that separate the Dragonborn from those whose skin bears no such armor. Eyes that hold depths of ancient wisdom can inspire trust and respect, but also create distance from those who cannot share such perspectives. Voices that carry harmonics of true dragon speech can command attention and convey authority, but may struggle to express the simple human emotions that connect individuals across racial boundaries. Yet it is in the breath weapons that the central paradox of dragonborn nature finds its most profound expression. The ability to exhale elemental force represents the purest manifestation of draconic power available to mortal beings, a gift that connects each individual to the cosmic forces that shaped reality itself. When dragonborn breathe fire or frost, lightning or acid, they participate in acts of creation and destruction that echo the fundamental processes by which the universe maintains its dynamic equilibrium. This participation in cosmic forces carries with it responsibilities that extend far beyond the immediate effects of any particular exhalation. Each use of a breath weapon is simultaneously an individual choice and a collective statement about what dragonborn heritage represents in the contemporary world. The fire that forges tools serves different moral purposes than the fire that burns enemies. The frost that preserves food makes different claims about draconic nature than the frost that freezes opponents in their tracks. The communities that emerged from the Great Diaspora faced the challenge of teaching these distinctions to young dragonborn, who inherited their abilities without automatically understanding their significance. The traditional clan structures that had once transmitted such knowledge through established hierarchies and formal ceremonies had been shattered by exile and integration into foreign societies. New methods had to be developed that could preserve essential wisdom while adapting to radically changed circumstances. The breathing schools that developed in response to this need represented innovative syntheses of ancient tradition and contemporary necessity. Rather than simply teaching technical control of breath weapons, these institutions focused on the ethical frameworks that should govern their use. Students learned not just how to regulate the intensity and direction of their exhalations, but when such power should be employed, and for what purposes. Master Peraxis Ethic Flame, founder of the premier breathing school in Whitehaven, developed curricula that required students to examine historical examples of breath weapon use and evaluate their moral implications. The Siege of Vor Kragal, where dragonborn defenders had used coordinated fire breath to create barriers that protected civilians while channeling enemy forces into killing zones, served as a case study in the proper balance between defensive necessity and proportional response. The Massacre of Thornbrook, where corrupted dragonborn had used acid breath to dissolve an entire village in retaliation for imagined slights, provided a stark example of how draconic gifts could be perverted when wielded without proper moral restraint. These historical analyses were complemented by practical exercises that tested students' ability to apply theoretical principles in challenging situations. Simulated scenarios required them to make split-second decisions about whether to use their breath weapons, how much force to employ, and what alternatives might achieve the same objectives with less potential for harm. The goal was not to create warriors or enforcers, but to develop individuals who understood the full weight of their inherited capabilities and could use them wisely in service to just causes. Yet, technical training and moral education, however sophisticated, could not address the deeper questions about identity and purpose that every dragonborn eventually confronted. What did it mean to be simultaneously mortal and touched by divinity? How should beings who carried such power relate to those who possessed no similar abilities? What responsibilities came with gifts that had been freely given rather than earned through merit or effort? These questions became particularly acute for dragonborn living in integrated societies, where their abilities set them apart from neighbors and colleagues who might never fully understand the burdens that accompanied such gifts. The constant awareness of possessing power that could harm or help in equal measure created psychological pressures that manifested in various ways. Some dragonborn became overly cautious, afraid to use their abilities even when appropriate. Others grew careless about the effects of their actions on those around them. Still others developed attitudes of superiority that echoed the imperial arrogance their people had supposedly abandoned. The philosophical schools that emerged to address these challenges drew upon wisdom traditions from multiple sources, combining Dragonborn ancestral teachings with insights from human, elven, dwarven, and other cultures' approaches to questions of power and responsibility. The Academy of Balanced Thought, established through collaborative effort between Dragonborn scholars and intellectuals from a dozen different peoples, became the premier center for exploring what it meant to live with inherited power in a world that valued earned achievement. Professor Saradith Mindweaver, whose own journey from bitter exile to respected educator embodied the transformation her people had undergone, developed theoretical frameworks that helped Dragonborn understand their place in the broader cosmos without falling into either self-aggrandizement or self-deprecation. Her seminal work, The Ethics of Inherited Advantage, argued that unearned gifts created obligations rather than privileges, requiring their recipients to use them in service to the common good rather than for personal advancement. According to her analysis, the Dragonborn occupied a unique position in the moral universe, beings who possessed capabilities that clearly exceeded normal mortal limitations, while remaining fully subject to the vulnerabilities and needs that characterized all finite existence. This paradoxical status made them natural bridges between different realms of experience, capable of understanding both the perspectives of those who wielded great power and the concerns of those who lived without such advantages. The practical implications of this bridge-building role became apparent as Dragonborn increasingly found themselves serving as mediators, translators, and facilitators in situations where different peoples needed to cooperate despite fundamental differences in their capabilities and worldviews. Their own experience of navigating between mortal limitations and draconic gifts gave them insights into the challenges faced by anyone attempting to work across significant disparities in power or privilege. Ambassador Thorak Harmony Forge's successful mediation of the Sunset Valley Accord exemplified this bridge-building function at its most effective. The negotiations involved human farmers whose livelihoods depended upon reliable water access, elven foresters whose spiritual practices required undisturbed woodland habitats, dwarven miners whose operations were essential to regional economic stability, and halfling traders whose commercial networks connected the valley to broader markets. Each group possessed legitimate interests that seemed to conflict irreconcilably with the needs of the others. Thorak's approach drew upon his understanding of how different types of power could be balanced rather than simply opposed. His Dragonborn heritage allowed him to speak with authority about the responsible use of capabilities that exceeded normal limitations, while his personal experience of adaptation and integration gave him credibility when discussing the need for compromise and mutual accommodation. Most importantly, his breath weapon abilities provided dramatic but non-violent demonstrations of what destructive force looked like when properly controlled and channeled toward constructive purposes. The accord that emerged from months of careful negotiation created new models for resource sharing that satisfied all parties' essential needs while establishing precedents for similar situations throughout the region. More significantly, the process demonstrated that even apparently irreconcilable differences could be harmonized when approached with wisdom, patience, and genuine commitment to finding solutions that served the common good rather than merely protecting particular interests. These successes in external relations were matched by equally important developments within Dragonborn communities as they grappled with questions about their own future direction and ultimate destiny. The ancient prophecies that had sustained them through the darkest periods of exile spoke of restoration and renewal, but the interpretation of these promises had evolved significantly as their circumstances changed and their understanding deepened. The literal reading that had once inspired dreams of rebuilt floating cities and restored imperial dominion had given way to more nuanced interpretations that emphasized spiritual and cultural revival rather than political reconstruction. The scattered children of dragons were indeed returning home, but their true home was revealed to be not a geographical location but a state of consciousness. The recognition of their role as living bridges between different realms of existence and different people's experiences. The floating cities were rising again, but they took the form of elevated ideals and principles rather than airborne architecture. The communities that Dragonborn had built within integrated societies represented new kinds of aerial construction, social structures that soared above the limitations of racial prejudice and cultural insularity, while remaining grounded in practical concerns about mutual welfare and shared prosperity. The restoration of Dragonborn greatness was occurring, but greatness was redefined as excellence in service rather than dominance over others. The abilities that had once been used to enforce imperial will were now employed to facilitate cooperation, protect the vulnerable, and solve problems that required capabilities beyond normal mortal reach. Power was measured not by the capacity to compel obedience, but by the skill to inspire voluntary collaboration toward worthy goals. Yet even as these reinterpretations provided guidance for contemporary action, they also raised new questions about the ultimate trajectory of Dragonborn development. If their people were indeed evolving towards some higher purpose, what form would that evolution take? Were the dragon marked harbingers of a transformation that would eventually affect all who carried draconic blood, or were they exceptional individuals whose unique gifts served specific historical needs without implying broader changes in their people's fundamental nature? The emergence of new abilities and enhanced sensitivities among Dragonborn populations suggested that their heritage was not a fixed inheritance, but a dynamic potential that continued to unfold in response to changing circumstances and spiritual development. The breath weapons that had once been limited to specific elemental types began to show greater flexibility among individuals who had undergone intensive moral and philosophical training. The natural longevity that had always characterized their people seemed to be increasing among those who lived according to principles of service and mutual respect. Most remarkably, some Dragonborn began to demonstrate abilities that transcended the traditional boundaries between their heritage and conventional magical practice. They could shape elemental forces without relying solely on their breath weapons, communicate across vast distances through methods that resembled telepathy more than speech, and occasionally perceive events and influences that existed beyond the normal range of mortal senses. These developments suggested that the relationship between dragons and their mortal children was not a historical curiosity, but an ongoing process of mutual evolution. The ancient worms had not simply created servants and then abandoned them to independent existence. They had initiated a collaboration that continued to develop as both partners gained new understanding of their shared potential and responsibilities. The theological implications of this continuing relationship challenged traditional assumptions about the boundaries between mortal and divine realms. If Dragonborn could indeed evolve toward capabilities that approached those of their draconic ancestors, what did this suggest about the nature of divinity itself? Were the gods distant powers who occasionally intervened in mortal affairs, or were they active partners in an ongoing process of creation that invited mortal participation and collaboration? The synthesis temples that emerged to explore these questions brought together religious traditions from multiple cultures, creating worship practices that honored the divine aspects of existence, while recognizing the potential for mortal beings to participate in cosmic processes traditionally reserved for higher powers. The ceremonies conducted in these temples incorporated Dragonborn breath weapons, not as demonstrations of inherited superiority, but as contributions to collective spiritual work that required diverse capabilities and perspectives. High Priestess Cassandra Unity Flame, whose own spiritual journey had taken her from bitter exile through religious extremism to balanced wisdom, developed liturgies that celebrated the complementary nature of different people's gifts, while maintaining respect for the unique contributions that each could make. The morning services that began each day in her temple included moments when participants of all races would contribute their particular abilities to shared prayers, humans offering the intensity of their brief but passionate devotion, elves providing the depth of their ancient wisdom, dwarves contributing the stability of their enduring faith, and Dragonborn adding the elemental power that connected all beings to the fundamental forces of creation. These interfaith practices produced unexpected results that seemed to validate theoretical claims about the potential for mortal participation in divine work. Prayers conducted with such multiracial cooperation appeared to have tangible effects that exceeded what any single tradition could achieve independently. Healing services that incorporated Dragonborn breath weapons with other people's spiritual practices produced recoveries that conventional medicine could not explain. Community blessings that drew upon diverse traditions seemed to create protective influences that shielded neighborhoods from both natural disasters and hostile actions. Yet perhaps the most significant outcome of these spiritual experiments was their demonstration that Dragonborn heritage achieved its fullest expression, not in isolation, but in cooperation with other people's gifts and perspectives. The power that flowed through Draconic bloodlines was amplified rather than diminished when combined with human passion, elven wisdom, dwarven persistence, and the countless other qualities that different races brought to shared endeavors. This realization fundamentally transformed Dragonborn understanding of their own identity and purpose. They were not fallen nobles awaiting restoration to lost thrones, nor were they exceptional beings destined to rule over lesser peoples. They were participants in a cosmic symphony that required every voice to achieve its intended harmony, contributors to a collaborative work of creation that could not be completed by any single group, acting alone. The legacy they inherited from their draconic ancestors was not a burden of superiority to be maintained, or a shame of failure to be overcome, but a responsibility to serve as living bridges between different realms of existence and different people's experiences. Their breath weapons were not weapons at all, but tools for connecting the elemental forces that shaped reality to the conscious purposes that guided moral choice. Their scales were not armor that separated them from others, but reflective surfaces that could catch and redirect light, creating patterns of beauty that enhanced everyone's perception of the world's fundamental glory. The flame that burned within every Dragonborn throat was revealed to be not the fire of destruction or the heat of domination, but the light of illumination that could guide all peoples toward better understanding of their shared destiny and mutual dependence. When properly understood and properly used, Draconic heritage served not to elevate its bearers above others, but to help everyone rise toward their highest potential for wisdom, compassion, and creative collaboration. As we reach the end of this chronicle of Dragonborn history and transformation, we see that their story is far from finished. The scattered children have indeed found their way home, but home is revealed to be not a place but a purpose. The ongoing work of building bridges between different worlds, different peoples, different possibilities for what mortal existence might become when guided by wisdom, rather than dominated by fear. The floating cities rise again each time. Dragonborn use their gifts to elevate the communities they serve, creating social structures that soar above the limitations of prejudice and insularity, while remaining grounded in practical concern for mutual welfare. The ancient empire is restored each time they choose service over dominance, cooperation over conquest, and shared prosperity over privileged isolation. In every breath weapon used to forge rather than destroy, in every moment of strength exercised to protect rather than oppress, in every choice to build bridges rather than walls, the true legacy of scale and flame finds its expression. The Dragonborn have learned that their greatest treasure is not the power they inherited from their ancestors, but the wisdom they have gained through their journey from pride to humility, from isolation to integration, from seeing themselves as rulers of others to understanding themselves as servants of the greater good that encompasses all thinking beings. Their unfinished destiny calls them forward, not to reclaim what was lost, but to create what has never existed before. A civilization based not on the dominance of the strong over the weak, but on the collaboration of the diverse in service to shared ideals. In accepting this calling, they honor both their draconic heritage and their mortal limitations, proving that the greatest strength lies not in transcending one's nature, but in fulfilling its highest possibilities, through conscious choice and deliberate action, guided by love rather than fear, wisdom rather than pride, and hope rather than despair.